Tonight, before anything else, I want you to picture a low green hill above a slow brown river, in the soft last light of a day thousands of years ago, in the middle of a long peninsula that reaches down like a leg and a foot into a warm and shining sea. The river moves quietly below, wide and unhurried and the colour of weak tea, curling around the feet of the hills in a long lazy bend. And on its banks the reeds stand still in the windless evening, and here and there a marsh bird lifts and settles again with a small complaint. There are 7 hills here or thereabouts, rising gently from the water and the marshy ground between them, and they are covered in rough grass and scattered oak and a few grazing sheep. And on the nearest of them a handful of round huts stand with their pointed thatched roofs, their walls of mud and woven branches, a thin blue thread of smoke rising from a cooking fire and leaning slowly out over the valley. A boy sits in the doorway of one of these huts with a stick across his knees, watching the sheep, watching the river, watching the light go slowly out of the sky and turn from gold to rose to a deep and quiet violet behind the far blue hills. He does not know, and could not possibly imagine, that the muddy little cluster of huts behind him, this poor and ordinary and rather swampy place, will one day be the centre of the largest and most powerful thing the world has yet seen. A city whose name will be spoken for the next 2,500 years, whose language will still be shaping the tongues of half the world long after the last of its walls have fallen, whose roads and laws and arches and ideas will run like buried roots beneath everything that comes after. He only knows that the sheep must be brought in, and that the fire is warm, and that the evening is coming on, and all around this small and ordinary scene there lies the enormous patient silence of a land that is waiting, without knowing it is waiting, for something very large to begin. That is where we are going tonight. Not to one year, or one battle, or one famous name, but across the whole immense life of a city and a people who began as nothing at all, as herdsmen in the mud by a river crossing, and who rose, slowly and stubbornly and over the span of 1,000 years, to rule the whole of the known world from Britain to the desert, and who then declined, just as slowly, and fell, and left the wreck of their greatness lying across the whole of Europe like the bones of some enormous animal, for everyone who came after to wonder at and to build from. We are going to travel from the very beginning of it, from a time before there was any such thing as a Roman, all the way through to the slow, strange evening of it, when the last emperor in the West was a boy with a borrowed name, and the long day was quietly over. It is a very long road, longer even than the roads they themselves would one day build across the world, and there is no hurry at all. We have the whole night. So before we take a single step along it, let us first take care of you. Settle now into whatever stillness you have managed to make for yourself tonight. Let the lamp grow dim, if there is a lamp. Let the screen grow dim. Let the small weight of the day, all the little things that were said and left unsaid, all the tasks half done and the worries half formed, let all of it slip down from your shoulders, one quiet inch at a time, and pool on the floor beside you, where you can leave it safely until morning. You do not need to carry any of it into the night. You do not need to follow the story closely. You do not need to remember a single name or date. My voice is only here to be a low and steady sound in the dark, a soft road for your mind to wander down until it wanders off the edge of waking altogether and into sleep, which is where I am hoping, very gently, to lead you. If you find that you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through the past, and only if you truly do, you might think about subscribing, because it does genuinely help these calm little films find the other people out there who are lying awake in the dark and looking for something soft to carry them off. And if you would like to, before your eyes close for good, you might leave your town and your local time down in the comments below. There is something quietly lovely in it. The thought of all of us scattered across the turning world in 100 different hours and 100 different kinds of dark, all lying still and listening to the same old story of the same old river and the same 7 hills. It helps other sleepless souls find their way here and find their way to rest, But if your eyes are already growing heavy, then do not trouble yourself with any of that. Just stay where you are, and let the sound of my voice go on, and let us begin, very gently, at the beginning, which is always earlier than you think. For to understand how the little huts on the hill became the mistress of the world, we must go back even before the huts. Back before there was anyone at all standing on those hills to light a fire, back to the shape of the land itself, which decided so much of what would happen there. Picture the whole long peninsula then, this leg of land reaching down into the middle sea, with a great spine of mountains running down the length of it, cold and grey and snow-capped in the winters. And on either side of that spine a scatter of plains and valleys and rivers running down to the coasts. It is a good land, on the whole, a kind land, warmer and gentler than the lands to the north, with long hot summers and mild wet winters, with soil that will grow wheat and barley, and above all, with hillsides that love the two plants that would feed and enrich the people here for all the long centuries to come, the olive and the vine. In the middle of the western side of this peninsula there is a broad plain of rich volcanic earth, watered by that slow brown river, and it is called, in the old tongue, Latium, the flat land, and the people who came to live upon it were called, from the land, the Latins. They were not, in the beginning, anything special. They were one people among many in that crowded peninsula, farmers and herders living in small villages of huts on the hilltops, where it was safe, coming down in the daytime to work the fields and pasture the flocks in the valleys. To the north of them lived a far richer and more sophisticated people, called the Etruscans, who had cities and kings and gold and a strange dark religion of reading the future in the livers of sheep and the flight of birds, and who traded across the sea and lived very well indeed. And to the south, along the coasts and on the island of Sicily, there were the colonies of the Greeks, that brilliant and quarrelsome people we may have spoken of on another night, who had come sailing west generations before to plant new cities on foreign shores, and who brought with them their alphabet, and their gods and their olives, and their endless clever talk. So the little villages of Latium sat between two brighter and older neighbours, the Etruscans above and the Greeks below, and for a long time nothing much seemed likely to come of them at all. But there was one spot on the river that mattered more than the rest, and it is our spot, the Seven Hills. Here the river could be crossed, at a place where an island sat in the middle of the stream and broke it into two shallower channels, and here the great road of the salt trade ran, for salt was dug from the flats at the river's mouth and carried up into the hills of the interior, where it was worth a great deal, and salt, in a world with no other way to keep meat and fish through the winter, was as good as money. So the hills by the river crossing were a place where paths met, and goods changed hands, and people came and went. And such places have a way of growing, slowly, into something more. And now, because this is the story of Rome, and because the Romans themselves loved this story more than almost any other, we must tell the tale that they told about how their city began. And we must tell it gently and without believing too much of it, the way you would tell an old family story that everyone knows is half invented and loves all the more for that. The Romans said that their beginning reached all the way back to the fall of a great and famous city far away across the sea, to the burning of Troy, that high-walled city on the eastern edge of the Greek world, whose long and terrible siege ended in fire and slaughter. And they said that out of that burning city, on the last dreadful night, one man escaped, a prince named Aeneas, carrying his old father upon his back and leading his small son by the hand, with the household gods of Troy clutched in his arms and the flames rising behind him. And this Aeneas, they said, wandered the seas for many long years, storm-tossed and grieving and always looking for a new home that the gods had promised him, until at last he came to the shores of Italy, to the mouth of that slow brown river, and there he settled, and his descendants became kings of a little town in Latium, and from his line, many generations later, the founders of Rome itself would come. It is a beautiful story, and it did a great deal of quiet work for the Romans, for it tied their own beginnings to the oldest and grandest tale the ancient world knew, and it made them, in their own eyes, not mud-dwelling latecomers, but the heirs of Troy, the children of a hero and, through him, of a goddess. We do not need to believe it to enjoy it. We only need to know that they believed it, or half believed it, and that it mattered to them, and let it drift on past us like the smoke of that first evening fire. And now we come to the two brothers, who are the real heart of the founding story, and whose tale the Romans told to every child. There was, they said, in one of those little Latin towns descended from Aeneas, a wicked uncle who seized the throne that was not his, and who, to keep the rightful line from ever rising against him, forced the young princess of that line to become a priestess sworn to have no children. But the god of war himself, they said, came to her, and she bore twin boys, and the wicked uncle, in his fear, ordered the babies drowned in the river. The servant sent to do it could not quite bring himself to the deed, and instead set the two infants adrift in a basket upon the flooded waters of the Tiber, and left them to the will of the gods. The basket drifted, and caught in the roots of a fig tree at the foot of one of the 7 hills, and there the 2 babies lay crying in the mud. And here comes the part that every Roman child knew and loved. A she-wolf, coming down to the river to drink, heard the crying, and instead of eating the children she gathered them to her and gave them her own milk and kept them warm, until a herdsman found them and took them home, and raised them as his own sons. They were named Romulus and Remus, and they grew up strong and quick and quarrelsome among the shepherds of the hills, not knowing who they truly were, until at last the truth came out, and they overthrew the wicked uncle, and set out to found a city of their own, back at the place by the river where the she-wolf had saved them. And it is here that the story turns dark, as founding stories so often do, for the 2 brothers could not agree. They quarrelled over which hill to build upon, and over which of them the gods most favoured, and over who should give his name to the new city, and the quarrel grew hot and bitter. And in the end, in a moment of rage, Romulus killed his own brother Remus, and stood alone upon the hill with his brother's blood upon his hands and a city to build. They said he killed him for leaping over the half-built wall in mockery to show how low and useless it was, which is the kind of thing that tends to end badly. And so Rome, by its own account, was born in the murder of a brother, and named for the brother who lived, and the Romans never forgot it, and never quite pretended it had not happened. And something of that first violence, that willingness to do the terrible thing for the sake of the city, would run in them like a dark thread all through their long history. They dated the founding of the city to a year we would count as 750, 3 years before the birth of Christ. And though no one really believes a city can be founded in a single year by a single man, the date stuck. And for the whole of their history the Romans counted the years from it, from the founding of the city, as we count ours from another birth in another small and unregarded town. Now, whatever the truth of the she-wolf and the murdered brother, we know that in those early centuries the little settlement on the hills did grow, and did knit its scattered villages together into something like a single town, and did come to be ruled, as almost everything was ruled in those days, by kings. The Romans remembered 7 of them, 7 kings across the first 2.5 centuries of the city, and though the stories of these kings are as much legend as history, they carry within them, like fruit around a stone, the memory of real things that really happened, and they are worth a gentle telling. Romulus, they said, was the first, the founder himself, and he did the founding things a first king does. He gathered to his new city all the rough and masterless men of the region, the runaways and the wanderers and the men who had nowhere else to go, and gave them a place, which is why Rome was from its very first day a city of the uprooted, a city that grew by taking in strangers, and this too would matter enormously later on, for Rome would always at its best have a genius for absorbing outsiders and making them Romans, which is a thing very few peoples have ever been willing or able to do. But a city of masterless men is a city of men without wives, and so, the story goes, Romulus solved this in the direct and appalling way of the old legends, by inviting the neighbouring people, the Sabines, to a great festival, and then at a signal seizing their unmarried daughters and carrying them off to be the wives of the Romans. It is not a pretty tale, and we will not linger on it, except to note that it ends as the Romans told it, not in endless war but in reconciliation, with the stolen women themselves stepping between their new husbands and their angry fathers to stop the fighting, and the two peoples, Roman and Sabine, agreeing to become one. And that too is the pattern, violence, and then the folding in of the enemy, the making of two peoples into one. After Romulus came a very different sort of king, a quiet and pious Sabine named Numa, who reigned, they said, for more than 40 peaceful years, and who did not make war at all, but instead gave the Romans their religion, their calendar, their priesthoods, and their great respect for the proper forms of worship. If Romulus gave Rome its sword, Numa gave it its altar, and the Romans liked to think that they held both in balance, the fierceness and the piety, the readiness for war and the careful reverence for the gods, and that this balance was the secret of their strength. The kings who followed were a mixture, some warlike and some builders, and under them the city grew and drained its marshes and paved its central meeting place, the low ground between the hills that would become the Forum, the beating heart of Roman public life for 1,000 years. The last 3 kings, the tradition said, were Etruscans, from that older and richer people to the north, and under them Rome became for a time a proper city in the Etruscan style, with a great temple on the hill they called the Capitol, with walls and drains and a growing power over its neighbours. But the last of these Etruscan kings was a tyrant, and the Romans remembered him with a shudder as Tarquin the Proud, a man who had seized the throne by murder and held it by fear, who put men to death without trial and ruled without listening to anyone, and whose whole family in the end became a byword for arrogance and cruelty. And it was the crime of his son that brought the whole thing down. The son, the stories said, violated a noble and virtuous Roman wife named Lucretia, a woman famous for her goodness, and she, in her shame and grief, gathered her father and her husband and made them swear vengeance, and then took her own life before their eyes, rather than live dishonoured. And the men of Rome, carrying the story of that outrage from house to house, rose up in a fury and drove out the king and all his family, and swore a great and solemn oath that never again, so long as Rome should stand, would they be ruled by a king. That oath, that deep and almost superstitious horror of one-man rule, of the very word king, would last for 500 years, and would shape everything, and would in the end be the death of more than one great man who seemed to reach too near a crown. We would date the driving out of the kings to a year around 509 before the birth of Christ, and it is one of the true turning points of the whole story, for in place of the king the Romans now built something new, something they called the res publica, the public thing, the commonwealth, the thing that belongs to all, from which we take our own word republic. And here we should pause and settle a little deeper and look gently at what this new thing was, because it is one of the great inventions of the ancient world, and because the slow understanding of it will carry us pleasantly along for some time. The Romans, having thrown out their one king, were terrified of ever having another, and so they built a system whose whole design was to stop any single man from gaining too much power. In place of the king they elected, each year, not one leader but 2. 2 men, called consuls, who held the king's old powers between them, but held them together, each able to block the other, and, crucially, only for a single year, after which they must step down and let 2 others take their place. 2 men, so that neither could act alone, 1 year, so that no man could settle into power and grow roots, and behind them both, the Senate, a council of the elders and the leading men of the city, several hundred of them, who did not exactly rule but who advised, and whose advice carried such enormous weight, such deep reserves of custom and dignity and accumulated wisdom, that in practice the Senate was the steady centre of the whole state, the thing that endured while the consuls came and went like the changing of the year. And beyond the Senate there were the assemblies of the people, in which the citizens gathered to vote, to elect their magistrates, and pass their laws, and decide on war and peace. It was not a democracy in the Greek sense, not one man, one equal vote, for the votes were weighted heavily toward the wealthy and the well-born, and the whole thing was tangled about with ancient rules and religious forms that we would find baffling. But it was a republic, a state without a king, in which power was divided and shared and passed from hand to hand, in which the law stood above any man, and in which the Romans came to believe, with a fierce and lasting pride, that they governed themselves. And they built into it a great and generous safety valve, though only after a long and bitter struggle, and that struggle is worth the telling, for it is one of the quiet glories of the Roman story. For the early republic was ruled, in truth, by the old and noble families, the patricians, who held the priesthoods and filled the senate and took the consulships year after year among themselves, while the great mass of ordinary citizens, the plebeians, the farmers and craftsmen and small traders who did the work and fought the wars, had little say and less protection, and could be ground down by debt until they were little better than slaves. And the plebeians, being the ones who filled the army, at last found the one weapon that could not be taken from them. They simply left. They marched out of the city in a body, all of them, and withdrew to a nearby hill, and announced that they would not come back, would not fight, would not work, would not be Romans at all until they were given some protection under the law. It was a strike, in effect the first great strike in recorded history, and it worked, because a city cannot survive without its people, and the alarmed patricians gave way, and out of that first walkout and the long series of struggles that followed it, spread across the better part of 2 centuries. The plebeians slowly won their rights. They won officials of their own, the tribunes, whose persons were made sacred and inviolable, and whose single word could halt any act of the state, a power of veto so absolute that it seems almost mad, and yet it worked. They won the writing down of the laws, so that justice was no longer whatever the patrician judges said it was on the day, but a fixed and public thing carved on tablets of bronze for all to read. They won, in time, the right to hold the highest offices, even the consulship, even the priesthoods, until at last the old wall between patrician and plebeian had been worn almost entirely away, and Rome was governed by a mingled nobility of the old blood and the new, the men whose families had held high office, whatever their origin. And the remarkable thing, the thing worth carrying with you into the dark, is that the Romans did all this long and difficult remaking of who held power, very largely without bloodshed, by walkout and by law and by patient, stubborn negotiation across the generations, at a time when in most of the world such quarrels were settled with the knife. It would not always be so. There would come a day, centuries on, when Romans would settle their quarrels with the knife and the sword and the massacre in the streets, and when that day came, it would be the end of the Republic. But that is very far ahead of us, and the night is young, and for now the Republic is new and growing and finding its feet, and learning the great trick that it would practice for the next several hundred years, the trick of turning enemies into Romans, and of never, ever giving up. Let us follow then how the little city grew, for the first great labour of the Republic was simply to survive, and then to master the crowded peninsula around it, and this took the better part of 250 years, patient and grinding, and rarely glorious, a long, slow spreading like the roots of a tree. Rome was surrounded, in its early days, by peoples very like itself, the other Latin towns, the hill tribes, the Etruscan cities to the north, and it fought them all, year after year, in a rhythm so regular that each spring, when the campaigning season opened, the consuls would, as a matter of course, lead out the army against one neighbour or another, and each autumn bring it home again for the harvest. War was not, for the early Romans, some rare catastrophe. It was the ordinary business of the year, like ploughing, and they were extraordinarily good at it, not because they were more brilliant than their neighbours, but because they were more stubborn, more disciplined, and above all more willing to lose. This is the secret of Rome, if it has a single secret, and it is worth holding gently in your mind as we go. The Romans lost battles constantly. They were beaten and beaten and beaten again by better generals and fiercer armies, and it simply did not matter, because they would not, under any circumstances, admit that they were beaten. They would lose an army and raise another. They would lose that one and raise a third. They had a manner of treating a lost battle almost as an administrative inconvenience, a thing to be noted and then corrected by the raising of more men. And they had a settled and unshakable belief that so long as the city itself stood, they had not lost, and so they went on, and their enemies, who fought to win battles, could never quite understand a people who fought simply to outlast them. And once they had beaten a people, they did the other clever thing, the folding in, the making of enemies into Romans. They did not, on the whole, destroy the peoples they conquered or carry them off into slavery, though they could be terrible enough when crossed. Instead, they made treaties and took some land and then offered the defeated people a share, greater or lesser, in being Roman, a graded ladder of rights and citizenship that ran from full Roman citizens at the top down through half-citizens and allies with their own local government, all bound to Rome and, above all, bound to send soldiers to the Roman army when called. So every conquest made Rome not just larger but stronger, added not just territory but manpower, and the more Rome conquered the more soldiers it could raise, and the more soldiers it could raise the more it could conquer, in a slow rising spiral that no other power in Italy could match. But there was one terrible interruption to this steady growth, one catastrophe so shocking that the Romans remembered it with a shudder for the rest of their history, and it came from a direction no one had been watching. From over the great mountains to the north, out of the cold lands of Central Europe, came the Gauls, tall, fair-haired warriors, fierce and reckless, and utterly unlike the disciplined peoples of Italy, who swept down into the peninsula in a great migrating horde looking for land and plunder. And the Romans, marching out to meet them as they marched out to meet everyone, were caught by the sheer wild fury of the Gaulish charge and simply broken, their army shattered in an afternoon by a river not far from the city, and the road to Rome itself lay open. Most of the people fled. The Gauls poured into the almost empty city and burned it, house by house, the huts and the temples and the records and the ancient things, nearly all of it gone up in smoke. And the story went that only the steep rock of the capital held out, a last knot of defenders on the hilltop, saved one night from a surprise attack. So the legend said, by the cackling of the sacred geese who heard the climbers in the dark and roused the sleeping guards. The Gauls in the end did not stay, they were not city dwellers, and they took a great weight of gold to go away, and go away they did, back to the north, leaving the Romans to crawl out of the ashes and look at the ruin of everything. And here again is the Roman thing, the thing that made them what they were. They did not despair, and they did not leave. There was a movement, the stories say, to abandon the burned and unlucky site altogether and move to some other, finer place, and it was voted down. They stayed on the same 7 hills by the same brown river, and they rebuilt, quickly and without much planning, which is why the streets of Rome would be a crooked muddle forever after, and they built this time a great wall of heavy stone all around the city, and they set their jaws, and they went back to the patient business of mastering Italy, and they did not forget the Gauls, and in the fullness of time, centuries later, they would go north over the mountains and conquer the whole vast land the Gauls had come from, which is a long memory and a long revenge, and rather characteristic. So the conquest went on. Rome fought the other Latins, and in the end absorbed them. It fought the tough mountain people to the south, the Samnites, in a series of long and bitter wars across the rugged spine of Italy, and was beaten badly more than once, and once suffered a humiliation so complete. An entire army trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender and pass under a yoke of spears like cattle, that the shame of it entered the language, and yet it went on and raised more men, and in the end wore the Samnites down. And as Rome spread south down the peninsula, it came at last up against the rich and cultured Greek cities of the far south, the colonies of that brilliant sea-going people, and one of these cities, alarmed at the approach of the rough Latin upstarts, sent across the sea for help. And the help came in the form of one of the most glittering and tragic figures of the age, a Greek king named Pyrrhus, a cousin of the great conquering house of Macedon, a dazzling general with a professional army and a herd of war elephants, those enormous grey beasts that no Roman had ever seen, walking towers of muscle that could break any line of men. And Pyrrhus beat the Romans twice in great pitched battles, his elephants and his phalanx too much for them, and each time he expected them, as any sane people would, to come to terms, to admit the thing was decided and make peace. And each time, to his growing bewilderment, they refused and raised another army and came at him again. He won his battles and could not win his war, and after one of his costly victories, looking at the heaps of his own irreplaceable veterans dead upon the field, he is said to have remarked that one more such victory over the Romans would utterly ruin him. And from that weary king's remark, we have the phrase we still use for a win that costs more than it is worth, a hollow triumph, a victory that is really a kind of defeat. In the end, Pyrrhus gave up and sailed away to other wars and other adventures, and left the Greek cities of the south to their fate, and one by one they became Roman too. And with that, a little more than 250 years after the driving out of the kings, the whole of the Italian peninsula, from the northern plains down to the toe of the boot, was under the control of Rome, bound to her by that braided web of citizenship and alliance, sending her its young men to fill her legions. The muddy town by the river crossing was now the master of Italy, a power to be reckoned with, and across a narrow strip of blue sea to the south and west, watching this new giant rise, was the one power in the Western world that was richer, older and stronger than Rome, a great sea empire of merchants and sailors whose ships ruled the Middle Sea, whose city stood on the coast of Africa, and whose name was Carthage. And the meeting of these two, the land power and the sea power, the young republic and the old empire, would produce the longest, largest and most terrible war the world had yet seen. And it is to that war, and to the one extraordinary man who very nearly destroyed Rome forever, that we now, very gently, must turn. Carthage was, in those days, everything that Rome was not. Where Rome was a land power, a nation of stubborn farmer soldiers who fought on foot, Carthage was a sea power, a nation of merchants and sailors whose wealth came from trade across the whole western sea, whose fleets carried tin from the far north and gold from the deep south, whose warehouses on the African coast were piled with the goods of the world. It was an old city, older than Rome, founded by traders from the eastern shore of the sea, and it was rich beyond anything the Romans could imagine, and it hired its soldiers rather than raising them from its own people, buying fierce fighting men from Spain and Africa and the islands, which made its armies dangerous, but also, in a way that would matter greatly, a thing that could be bought and could run out, unlike the endless homegrown legions of Rome. The two powers came to blows, first over the great island that sits in the sea between Italy and Africa like a stepping stone, the island of Sicily, and the war that followed, the first of the three great wars between them, was fought for more than 20 years, mostly at sea, and it taught the Romans a hard and characteristic lesson. For the Romans had no navy worth the name, and Carthage ruled the waves, and any sensible people would have concluded that a land power simply could not defeat a sea power, and made the best peace they could. The Romans, instead, decided to become a sea power from nothing in the middle of a war. They took a wrecked Carthaginian warship that had run aground, and they copied it, plank by plank, and they built a whole fleet on that model, hundreds of ships. And they trained their farmer crews to row on benches set up on dry land while they waited for the ships to be finished, and then they went out and were promptly beaten, because they had no idea how to fight at sea, and then they built more ships and went out again. And they invented a device, a great boarding bridge with a spike on the end that would drop onto an enemy deck and hold the two ships together, so that they could turn a sea battle into the kind of fight they understood, a land battle of soldiers hacking at each other, only on a wooden deck in the middle of the water. And with such tricks, and with their bottomless stubbornness, they wore Carthage down across those 20 years, losing whole fleets to storms, hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men swallowed by the sea in single dreadful nights, and each time building again, until at last Carthage, exhausted and out of money to pay its hired men, made peace and gave up Sicily, which became the first Roman province beyond the sea. But the peace was a truce, not an end, and the hatred between the two cities only deepened, and in Carthage there was one family that nursed that hatred like a sacred fire, the family of a brilliant general named Hamilcar, who had fought the Romans in Sicily and never been beaten there, and never forgiven the loss of the war. And Hamilcar, the story goes, took his small son to the altar of the gods and made the boy swear a solemn oath that he would be the eternal enemy of Rome so long as he lived. And the boy swore it and kept it, and his name was Hannibal, and he would become the most dangerous man Rome ever faced, the nightmare at the edge of their sleep for 100 years and more. Hamilcar took his family and his army west to Spain, and there built a new empire of silver mines and warlike tribes to replace the wealth lost with Sicily, and there Hannibal grew up in the camp, raised to war from childhood, and when his father and then his brother-in-law had died, and the army turned to him, he was still a young man, and he was ready. He did not wait for Rome to come to him. He gathered a great army in Spain, of Africans and Spaniards and Gauls, with a core of those terrible war elephants, and he did the thing that no one imagined could be done, the thing that has kept his name alive for more than 2,000 years. He marched his whole army north out of Spain and along the coast, and then he turned inland and marched it up into the great cold wall of mountains that guards the northern edge of Italy, the Alps, in the autumn, with the snows coming on. It was very nearly impossible. The paths were narrow and icy, the mountain tribes rolled boulders down on the struggling column and cut off stragglers. Men and animals slipped from the tracks and fell into the white ravines, the elephants floundered in the snow. The cold killed the southern soldiers who had never seen such country, and by the time Hannibal came down the far side into the plains of northern Italy, he had lost nearly half his army to the mountains. But he had done it. He was in Italy, behind all of Rome's defences, in the last place on earth the Romans had thought to look for an enemy, and the Gauls of the north, who hated Rome, flocked to join him, and the war had come home. What followed was the closest Rome ever came, in all its long history, to utter destruction, and it unfolded across 16 terrible years up and down the length of Italy. Hannibal was simply a better general than any man Rome could field against him, one of the greatest who ever lived, and he proved it again and again. He met the first Roman armies sent against him and destroyed them. He lured a Roman army into the fog by a lake, an ambush laid so perfectly along the shore that whole legions were driven into the water and drowned in their armour before they even understood they were surrounded. And then, when Rome raised the greatest army it had ever assembled, tens of thousands of men, the largest force in its history, and sent it to crush him once and for all on a plain in the south called Cannae, Hannibal did to it the thing that generals have studied ever since. He drew up his line so that its centre was weak and bowed forward toward the Romans, and when the great mass of the legions charged into that centre and pushed it, the Carthaginian line did not break but bent, folding slowly backward like a bow being drawn, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper in, until the wings of Hannibal's army, his best troops held back on either side, closed in from left and right, and his cavalry, having swept the field, came round and sealed the trap from behind. And the largest army Rome had ever raised found itself packed together in a shrinking ring, so tightly crushed that many could not even raise their weapons, and it was not defeated so much as slaughtered methodically from the outside in through a long summer afternoon, until tens of thousands of Romans lay dead in a single field, one of the bloodiest days of battle in all of human history, a loss so vast that there was hardly a noble family in Rome that did not lose someone, hardly a street that did not fill with mourning. It should have been the end. By every rule of war it was the end. Hannibal's officers urged him to march at once on the city itself, and any other enemy Rome had ever faced would have sued for peace after Cannae, would have accepted whatever terms were offered and been grateful to survive. And here, one last time, we meet the thing that made Rome Rome. They did not surrender. In the ashes of the worst defeat in their history, with their best army gone and Hannibal loose in Italy and half their allies going over to him, the Senate met and voted, calmly, to raise more men, to enroll even boys and slaves into new legions, to refuse absolutely to ransom the prisoners Hannibal held, to forbid the very word peace to be spoken, and to thank the beaten general who had survived Cannae for not despairing of the Republic. They would not fight Hannibal in open battle again, having learned at last that they could not beat him there. Instead, they shadowed him, wore him down, cut off his supplies, retook the towns that had gone over to him the moment his back was turned, and simply refused, year after year after year, to lose the war, though they had lost every battle. And slowly, slowly the tide turned, not because they beat Hannibal, but because they outlasted him, as they had outlasted everyone. Hannibal sat in Italy for years, undefeated and unable to win, his army slowly melting away with no way to replace it, waiting for help from home that the merchants of Carthage were too divided and too cautious to send in time. And meanwhile Rome found at last a general of its own who could match him. A bold young man named Scipio, who had survived Cannae as a youth and studied Hannibal's methods with cold attention, and who took the war away from Italy altogether. Scipio went to Spain and conquered the whole Carthaginian empire there, cutting off its silver and its soldiers. And then he did the truly daring thing. He sailed to Africa and threatened Carthage itself, so that the Carthaginians, in a panic, had to call Hannibal home, out of Italy, after all those years, to defend his own city. And so the two greatest generals of the age at last faced each other, on a plain in Africa called Zama, the master and the pupil, and this time it was Scipio who had learned the lessons, and the Roman cavalry that swept the field and came round from behind, and when the long day ended Hannibal was beaten, for the first and only time, and Carthage was finished as a great power, stripped of its fleet and its empire and its pride, left to live on as a merchant town under Rome's heavy shadow. Hannibal himself lived on for many years, a wandering exile at foreign courts, always plotting, always unforgiving, until at last an old man cornered by Roman agents who would not rest until the oath-keeper of their nightmares was dead. He took poison rather than be taken, and so kept his boyhood oath to the very end, the enemy of Rome so long as he lived. And Rome, having survived the thing that should have destroyed it, emerged from that long agony, changed, hardened, and suddenly frighteningly powerful, the master not just of Italy now, but of the Western Sea, and it turned that terrible new strength outward upon the whole of the known world. In the years after the great war with Hannibal, Rome turned east, into the old and wealthy world of the Greek kingdoms, the lands that the conquests of Alexander had left divided among his quarrelling generals and their descendants, the kingdoms of Macedon and Syria and Egypt, ancient and rich and cultured, and by now rather soft. And Rome, drawn in at first as the ally of this or that Greek city against this or that Greek king, found that its hard legions of farmer soldiers, tempered by the long ordeal of the Punic Wars, could beat the famous Macedonian phalanx, the massed hedge of long pikes that had conquered the world under Alexander, could beat it because the flexible Roman formations could find its flanks and its gaps, where the rigid pike wall could not turn. And once the Romans understood this, they simply took the whole Eastern world apart, kingdom by kingdom, across the next lifetime. They beat Macedon and abolished its monarchy. They humbled the great kingdom of Syria. They reduced the proud Greek cities to obedience, and when the old city of Corinth defied them, they destroyed it utterly, as a lesson, burning it and selling its people into slavery, in the same year, as it happened, that they at last returned to Africa and did the same to Carthage. For there had grown up in Rome, in those years, a hard old senator who ended every speech he made, on whatever subject, with the same grim words, that Carthage must be destroyed. And in the end Rome found a pretext, and besieged the old rival one final time, and took it after a desperate resistance, and burned it street by street, and levelled it to the ground, and made its territory another province. So that of the two great cities that had fought for the mastery of the Western world, only one now remained. and Rome was mistress of the sea, from Spain to Syria, from the plains of the north to the sands of Africa, and the wealth of the whole world began to flow into the city on the 7 hills, and it is here, at the very summit of Rome's success, that the seeds of its long inner ruin were quietly sown, and this is a part of the story worth telling slowly and gently, for it is the great tragedy at the heart of the whole Roman tale, and it turns not on battles but on land, and on money, and on the slow poisoning of a free state by its own good fortune. For the conquests brought 2 things flooding into Italy, and both of them, in the end, were poison. The first was slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, whole populations of the conquered dragged back in chains to be sold in the markets, and these slaves went, above all, to work the land on great estates bought up by the rich men who had grown enormously wealthy from the wars and the plunder and the governing of the provinces. And the second thing was that very wealth, concentrated in the hands of a few, the senators and the great families, who used it to buy up more and more of the land of Italy and stock it with more and more slaves. And what happened to the ordinary Roman farmer, the small free citizen soldier who had always been the backbone of the Republic, the man who left his plough each spring to fight Rome's wars and came home each autumn to his few acres? He was ruined. He came home from years of fighting far away to find his little farm gone to weeds, and his rich neighbour's slave worked estate spreading all around it, and he could not compete with slave labour that need not be paid, and he sold up or was pushed off and drifted, with his family, into the city, into Rome, to join a growing mass of poor and landless citizens with no work and no property and nothing to do but crowd into the tenements and depend on the doles of grain and the favours of the powerful. And so the very conquests that made Rome rich hollowed out the class of sturdy independent farmers on whom the whole Republic, its armies and its assemblies and its ancient virtue, had always rested, and no one quite knew what to do about it. And the ones who tried to do something about it were killed for it, and their killing broke something in Rome that was never mended. The first to try were 2 brothers of a noble and high-minded family who saw the ruin of the small farmer and tried, by law, to break up some of the vast estates and give land back to the landless poor, to restore the old backbone of the state. It was a moderate and sensible and even conservative aim, a wish to return to the way things had been, but it threatened the wealth of the great landowners who filled the Senate, and they would not have it, and when the elder brother, as tribune, pushed his land law through against their will, they and their followers fell upon him in the street and clubbed him to death, him and hundreds of his supporters, and threw their bodies into the river. It was the first time in the long history of the Republic that a political quarrel among Romans had been settled by murder, that Roman blood had been shed in the streets of Rome over a vote, and it was as if a great and terrible door had been opened that could never again be shut. The younger brother took up the cause, and pushed it further, and he too was hunted down and killed with thousands of his followers, and from that time on violence became a tool of Roman politics. First the mob and the riot, and then, in time, the army itself. For the next 100 years the story of Rome is the slow and dreadful story of the Republic tearing itself apart, of ambitious men reaching for more and more power, and finding fewer and fewer rules to stop them, and it moves through a series of great and dangerous figures, each larger than the last. There was a rough soldier named Marius, a man of no great family who rose by sheer military talent, and who, facing a shortage of the propertied farmers who had always filled the legions, threw open the army to the landless poor, the very men with nothing, and armed them and paid them, and led them to victory, and this changed everything. For these new soldiers, who owned no land to go home to, came to look not to the Republic, but to their general, for their pay and their plunder and their promised farms at the end of their service, and so the legions slowly ceased to be the army of Rome, and became the private armies of whoever led them. And once a general had an army loyal to him and not to the state, it was only a matter of time before one of them turned that army against Rome itself, and one of them did. His name was Sulla, once an officer under Marius and then his bitter rival, and when the two of them quarrelled over who should command a great war in the east, Sulla did the unthinkable, the thing no Roman had ever done. He marched his army on Rome, his own city, and took it by force, and made himself master of it. And then the old man Marius did the same in his turn, and there followed a nightmare of massacre and counter-massacre, of proscription lists posted in the forum, naming the men to be killed and their property seized, so that any man might find his own name on the list one morning and be cut down by bounty hunters before nightfall. Thousands of Rome's leading men murdered by other Romans, the heads of senators displayed in the public square. Sulla, in the end, made himself dictator, seized total power, used it to butcher his enemies and rewrite the laws to strengthen the Senate, and then, astonishingly, having done all that, laid it down again and retired to a private life of ease, as if to prove that it could be done, that a man could hold absolute power and give it back. But the lesson the ambitious young men of Rome took from Sulla was not that power could be surrendered, it was that power could be seized, that an army could take the city, that the old rules were dead, and they watched, and they waited, and they learned. And in the midst of all this, as if to show how thoroughly the old order was rotting, there came a great and terrible slave revolt, when a band of gladiators, trained fighting slaves kept to kill each other for the amusement of the crowd, broke out of their barracks under a leader named Spartacus, and raised an army of the enslaved, tens of thousands of them, the human machinery of the great estates rising up with farm tools and stolen weapons, and for 2 years they defeated Roman army after Roman army, and roamed up and down Italy, until at last the Republic gathered its strength and crushed them, and crucified 6,000 of the captured rebels along the great road leading to Rome, one cross every few dozen paces for mile upon mile upon mile, a long avenue of dying men left hanging as a warning, so that everyone travelling to the capital would pass beneath them and understand. It is one of the darkest images in all the Roman story, that road of crosses, and we will not dwell on it, except to let it stand as the measure of how hard and how frightened the great Republic had become, even as it ruled the world. And now into this dying Republic, this world of private armies and murdered reformers and roads lined with crosses, there stepped the man whose name has come to stand, in every language of the West, for a ruler and a master whose very name became the word for emperor, in tongues from the German to the Russian, more than 2,000 years after his death. He was born into an old but faded noble family, one of those ancient houses with a long name and not much money, and as a young man he was known for his charm, his ambition, his enormous debts, his careful courting of the common people, and a cool, watchful patience that hid an almost limitless drive. He climbed the ladder of Roman offices in the ordinary way, borrowing vast sums to pay for the games and shows that won the crowd's love, and he made himself the champion of the poor and the popular cause against the entrenched Senate, and he formed a quiet partnership with the 2 other most powerful men of the day, the richest man in Rome and the greatest general of the age, the 3 of them agreeing to share the state among themselves, an unofficial arrangement of 3 men that for a time ran everything. And then he took the thing he most needed, which was a great military command, a war of his own that would give him an army and the money and glory to match his rivals, and he took it in the one great land that lay still unconquered on Rome's doorstep, the wide and populous country to the north, beyond the Alps, the land of the Gauls, the descendants of those same fair-haired warriors who had burned Rome so many centuries before. And across nearly 10 years he conquered the whole of it, all of Gaul, a vast land of many fierce tribes, in a series of brilliant and merciless campaigns that he described himself in cold, clear, modest-seeming accounts that schoolchildren would puzzle over for the next 2,000 years. He was a general of the very first rank, quick and daring and lucky, adored by his soldiers, whom he led from the front and called his comrades and enriched beyond their dreams, and by the end of it he had killed or enslaved a great part of the population of Gaul, and added an enormous new territory to the Roman world, and forged, in his legions, the finest and most devoted army on earth. An army that was his, utterly and personally his. And that, of course, was the problem, for his rivals in Rome, and above all the great general who had been his partner and had now drifted into the arms of the Senate, watched him grow too large, and they determined to cut him down, to strip him of his command and his army, and call him home to face prosecution and ruin as a private citizen. And so the crisis came, the final crisis of the Republic, and it came down to a small river in the north of Italy, a stream called the Rubicon, which marked the boundary of his province, the line beyond which a general was forbidden by ancient and sacred law to bring his army toward Rome. To cross it under arms was to make war on his own country. He stood at that little river with his soldiers behind him and his whole future before him, knowing that to go back was to lose everything, and to go forward was to plunge the whole world into civil war, and he hesitated, they said on the bank, in the grey dawn, weighing it, and then he crossed, with a phrase that has come down to us as the mark of a decision from which there is no return, that the die was cast, the dice were thrown, there was no going back now, and with that single step across a shallow stream, he began the war that would end the Republic forever. The civil war that followed ranged across the whole Roman world, from Italy to Greece to Egypt to Africa to Spain, and he won it, everywhere, against all his enemies, with the same speed and daring and luck, until there was no one left who could stand against him, and he came back to Rome, the sole master of the entire Roman world, the first man ever to hold such power alone since the kings had been driven out 4.5 centuries before. And it is here, if you like, that we may pay off the little scene we began with, the boy in the hut on the hill above the river, for now that muddy village had become the greatest city in the world, a marble and brick metropolis of perhaps 1 million souls. Its 7 hills covered in temples and mansions and teeming tenements, its forum thronged, its power reaching to the ends of the earth. And one man stood at the head of all of it, and the boy watching his sheep in the violet dusk could never in 1,000 years have dreamed of what his little cluster of thatched roofs would become. He did not, this master of the world, make himself king, for the word king was still poison in Rome, still the thing the Republic had been founded to destroy. And he knew it, and he was careful, and he let it be known that he wanted no crown. But he took everything else. He had himself made dictator, the old emergency office of absolute power, not for the traditional 6 months, but for life. Dictator forever. And he gathered all the strings of the state into his own hands, and he began, with that same cool energy, to remake the Roman world, reforming the calendar into very nearly the one we still use today, so that the months of our own year still carry the shape he gave them, settling his veterans on new farms, planning great works, and generally governing as a wise and clement master rather than a bloody tyrant, sparing his defeated enemies, pardoning them, raising them to honour, in a deliberate policy of mercy that was itself a kind of power, the power to forgive. But mercy did not save him, and the crown he refused to wear killed him all the same, for to the proud old families of the Senate, the men who still dreamed of the free Republic, the plain fact was unbearable. That one man now held all power, that their votes and their offices and their ancient dignities were now his to grant or withhold, that they were no longer the rulers of the world but the courtiers of a master, however gentle. And a group of them, some 60 senators, some of them his bitter enemies, and some of them men he had pardoned and raised and trusted and even loved, formed a conspiracy to kill him and, they told themselves, to restore the Republic by his death. And on a day in the middle of March, a day whose name, the Ides of March, has echoed as a byword for betrayal ever since, they gathered around him in the meeting hall as he sat in his chair of state, and on a signal they drew the daggers hidden in their robes and fell upon him all together. And he fought at first, and then, they said, when he saw among the faces of his killers the face of a young man he had loved and favoured most of all, he gave up, and drew his robe over his head, and let them strike, and fell, pierced by many wounds, dead at the foot of a statue of his old rival, in a spreading pool of blood, on the floor of the Senate of Rome. And the men who killed him ran out into the streets, holding up their bloody daggers, and crying that Rome was free, that the tyrant was dead, that the Republic was restored. But the Republic was not restored, and could not be, for it was already dead, had been dying for 100 years, and all their daggers had killed was one man. The Roman people did not rise up to thank them. The people had loved him, and they mourned him, and when his will was read and it was found that he had left his gardens to the public and a gift of money to every citizen, their grief turned to fury, and the assassins found the city turning against them, and had to flee, and the great question of who would now rule the Roman world was thrown open once again, to be settled, as everything now was settled, by armies and by blood. The man who won the world in the end was the one almost no one had noticed. The young man named in the murdered dictator's will as his adopted son and heir, a slight and sickly youth of 18, far away when the daggers fell, with no army and no experience, and nothing but a great name suddenly dropped upon his shoulders. Everyone underestimated him, the hardened generals and the wily senators alike, and every one of them lived to regret it. For behind the pale and quiet exterior there was a mind as cold and patient and far-seeing as any in Roman history, a young man who understood, as his brilliant adoptive father perhaps had not, exactly what had gone wrong, and exactly how much a man could take, and exactly what he must never ever be seen to want. He gathered his father's veterans to his name, and made himself a power, and joined for a time with the murdered dictator's chief lieutenant, a bluff and popular soldier, the two of them together hunting down and destroying the assassins in a great battle in the east, and then dividing the Roman world between them, the young heir taking the west and the older soldier the rich and glamorous east, and the older soldier, in the east, fell under the spell of the most famous woman of the ancient world, the Queen of Egypt, the last of the line of Greek pharaohs who had ruled that ancient land since the days of Alexander, a woman of dazzling charm and cleverness and ambition. And he lived with her in eastern splendour, and gave her Roman lands, and had children by her, and seemed, to Roman eyes, to be turning into an eastern king, a betrayer of Rome, the servant of a foreign queen. And the cold young heir in the west used all of it, patiently, brilliantly, turning Roman opinion against his rival, painting him as a man bewitched and un-Romaned, until he could declare war not on a fellow Roman, which was hateful, but on the foreign queen, which was patriotic. And the two halves of the Roman world came together one last time in a great sea battle off the coast of Greece, at a place called Actium, where the young heir's fleet broke the fleet of the lovers, and the queen fled, and the soldier followed her, and their cause collapsed. And the two of them, cornered at last in Egypt with everything lost, died by their own hands, he falling on his sword and she, so the story goes, letting a venomous serpent bite her rather than be led in chains through the streets of Rome. And with their deaths the last rival was gone, and Egypt, the oldest kingdom in the world, became merely another Roman province, its grain feeding the mob of Rome, and the whole circle of the Middle Sea, every shore of it without exception, was now Roman, and one man ruled it all. And here we come to the true hinge of the entire story, the quiet genius at the very centre of it, for this young man, now the sole master of the Roman world exactly as his murdered father had been, had watched that father be cut down precisely because he had seemed to become a king, had seemed to take too openly the power that everyone could see he held. And the heir resolved never to make that mistake, and in that resolve he invented something entirely new, a way of holding total power while pretending, carefully and forever, not to hold it at all. He did not call himself king, nor dictator, nor master. He gave back to the Senate, with great ceremony, all his powers, and announced the restoration of the Republic, the return of the old free constitution, and the Senate, understanding the game perfectly, begged him to keep just a few powers for the good of the state, and he modestly accepted, and so he kept them all, but as gifts humbly received rather than as a crown seized. He took a new name, a word that meant something like the revered one, the one touched by the sacred, and by that name, Augustus. We know him. He called himself, in public, merely the first citizen, the leading man, first among equals, and he lived in a relatively modest house, and dressed plainly, and treated the senators with elaborate respect, and let all the old offices and elections and forms of the Republic go on exactly as before. The consuls elected each year, the Senate meeting and debating, the assemblies voting, so that a Roman could tell himself that the free Republic still lived. And behind all of it, quietly, he held every real lever of power, he commanded all the armies, controlled all the provinces that mattered, kept the loyalty of the soldiers with his own money, and could veto anything and command anything, and everyone knew it, and no one said it, in this polite and universal fiction. This agreement to pretend that the Republic still stood while one man in fact ruled it all was so cleverly built that it lasted, in one form or another, for the next 500 years. This is what we call the Empire, though the Romans themselves went on calling it the Republic for generations, and this quiet man, Augustus, is the first of what we call the emperors. Though he would have flinched at the word, and his long reign, more than 40 years of it, was the great turning of the whole Roman story, the moment when the endless civil wars finally stopped, when the exhausted world lay down at last and rested. And rest it did, for out of all that blood came, at last, peace, the thing we call the Roman peace, a peace that would last, more or less, across the whole vast empire, for 200 years, the longest stretch of general peace and order the Western world has ever known before or since. Under that peace the wounds of the civil wars slowly healed, and trade flowed safely along the roads and the sea lanes, and cities grew and prospered from Britain to the desert, and a man could travel from one end of the known world to the other. Thousands of miles, under one law and one coinage and one great sheltering power, in a safety that would not be seen again in those lands for more than 1,000 years after it was gone. Augustus found Rome, he boasted, a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and it was nearly true, for he covered the city in gleaming new temples and forums and public works, and around him gathered the greatest poets of the Latin tongue, who sang the glory of Rome and its long destiny, giving the empire not just its peace and its buildings, but its literature, its national epic, its sense of itself as a people chosen by the gods to rule and to civilize the world. And when at last, an old man full of years, he lay dying, he is said to have asked his friends whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and, being assured that he had, to have bidden them send him off with their applause, as an actor is applauded leaving the stage, and so the coldest and cleverest of all the Romans went out with a jest about the whole thing being a play, which, given what he had built, the vast and gorgeous fiction of a republic that was really a monarchy, was perhaps the truest thing he ever said. After the long and careful reign of Augustus, the power he had built passed down within his own family to a line of emperors we call, from the two old family names woven together in his house, the Julio-Claudians. And their story is a strange and lurid one, a family drama played out on the largest stage in the world, full of poison and suspicion and madness, and yet, underneath all the palace horrors, the vast machine that Augustus had built simply went on running. The peace held, the provinces were governed, the grain came in, the roads were kept, and the ordinary business of a quarter of the human race carried on more or less regardless of whatever nightmare was unfolding in the palace on the hill. The first to follow was the old emperor's stepson, a grim and able and deeply unhappy man, a fine general in his youth who had been passed over and recalled and manoeuvred into the succession almost against his will, and who ruled competently and gloomily for many years before retiring in bitterness to an island of pleasure and cruelty, leaving the actual governing to a scheming favourite who terrorised the Senate until the old emperor at last woke to the danger and had him destroyed. It was not a happy reign, and the man who followed it was very much worse, a young great-nephew of the house who came to the throne to general rejoicing, for he was the son of a beloved prince, and who then, whether from illness or the sheer intoxication of absolute power, or a streak of true madness, became the very picture of the tyrant, the emperor whose name has come down as a byword for cruelty and derangement, who humiliated the Senate for sport, who spent the treasure Augustus and his successor had so carefully hoarded, who is said to have talked of making his favourite horse a consul, whether in madness or in mockery of the senators no one could tell, and who was in the end cut down by his own guards in a corridor of the palace after less than 4 years, unmourned. And here the palace guards, the emperor's own household troops, discovered a great and dangerous truth, that they could make an emperor as easily as unmake one, for finding a frightened uncle of the murdered tyrant hiding behind a curtain. They dragged him out and made him emperor on the spot, a middle-aged man whom the whole court had dismissed his whole life as a stammering fool, a limping scholar fit only for his books. And he turned out, to everyone's astonishment, to be one of the better rulers of the line, shrewd and hard-working under the twitching and the stammer, a builder of harbours and aqueducts, a conqueror who at last added the cold and misty island of Britain, that far northern land at the very edge of the world, to the Roman Empire, so that the eagles now flew over the grey fields and forests of a country that had been to the Romans a place of myth and fog. But he was unlucky in his family, as they all were, and it was said that his own wife poisoned him with a dish of mushrooms to put her son upon the throne, and that son is the last and most infamous of the line. A name that has become, like so few others, a single word for a certain kind of ruler, the artist tyrant, the monster who fancies himself a genius. He began well enough, guided by wise advisers, but power rotted him as it had rotted his mad predecessor, and he came to believe himself a great singer and charioteer and poet, and forced the noble men and women of Rome to sit through his interminable public performances, from which, it was said, no one was permitted to leave, so that women gave birth in the seats, and men feigned death to be carried out. He had his own mother murdered, and his wife, and his old tutor, and any senator whose wealth he coveted or whose virtue rebuked him, and it was during his reign that a great fire broke out in Rome and burned for days, and consumed a huge part of the city, the crowded wooden tenements going up like tinder, and the rumour ran, whether truly or not, that the emperor had watched the flames from a high tower, and sung a song about the burning of an ancient city, delighting in the spectacle, and even that he had started the fire himself to clear ground for a golden palace he wished to build. And to turn the anger of the people away from himself, he looked for someone to blame, and he found a small and obscure new religious sect, followers of a teacher who had been executed in a far eastern province a generation before, a sect the Romans neither understood nor liked, who kept apart and would not worship the gods of the state, and he blamed the fire on them, and had them arrested and put to death in horrible and public ways, torn by beasts in the arena and burned as torches in his gardens. And this was the first great persecution of that new faith, which was called Christianity, and which, 3 centuries later, against all possibility, would inherit the empire that was now feeding it to the lions. But that is very far ahead. For now, this last and worst of the line at last drove even his own supporters and generals beyond endurance, and the provinces rose in revolt, and the Senate condemned him, and, abandoned by everyone, he fled the city, and, unable even to kill himself, had a servant help him drive in the blade, dying, they said, with a wail of self-pity at the waste of so great an artist as himself. And with him the whole family of Augustus, the line that had ruled Rome for 100 years, came to its end, for he left no heir, and the throne stood suddenly empty, and the terrible question that Augustus had hidden so cleverly for so long stood revealed at last, the question of what happens when there is no agreed way to choose the master of the world. What happened was a year of chaos, a year in which the armies of the empire, discovering at last that the secret of power was theirs, that emperors could be made not in the palace but in the camps, each raised up a general of their own and set them marching on Rome, so that in the space of a single year 4 different men were hailed as emperor, and 3 of them fell, in a spasm of civil war that spread from the Rhine to the desert, until the last of the 4, a tough and humorous old general of humble origins with the loyalty of the Eastern legions, marched in and put an end to it, and seized the throne and held it, founding a new line and restoring order out of the wreck. He was a plain, shrewd, thrifty man, this new emperor, with a countryman's dry wit even about his own approaching death. joking as he lay dying that he felt himself becoming a god, since dead emperors were made gods by decree, and he set the empire on its feet again, refilled the drained treasury, and began, on the site of that golden palace of the artist tyrant, hated symbol of the old madness, to build a gift to the Roman people that still stands. In its ruined majesty, as the very emblem of Rome itself, a vast oval arena of stone, rising in great tiers of arches, where 50,000 spectators could gather to watch the games, the gladiators and the beasts and the mock battles, the Colosseum as later ages would name it, the grandest of all the monuments to Rome's grandeur and to its cruelty both at once. For it was a marvel of engineering raised for the staging of slaughter, and in that it was perhaps the truest monument the Romans ever built to themselves. The sons of that thrifty old general ruled after him, the elder a gentle and much-loved prince who reigned only briefly, and in whose short time the great mountain in the south of Italy, long thought a quiet green hill, split open in fire and buried 2 whole cities beneath ash and stone in a single dreadful day, one of the most famous disasters of the ancient world, and after him the younger son, a suspicious and cruel man who ended, like so many, murdered in his own palace by those closest to him. And then, with his death, Rome entered upon what many have called the happiest age the human race has ever known. The long golden afternoon of the empire, a span of some 80 years, under a succession of 5 wise and able rulers, one after another, each of whom, having no son of his own, chose the best man he could find, and adopted him as his heir, so that the throne passed not by blood, which is a lottery, but by merit, which is not. And Rome was blessed, for those few generations, with the rarest thing in the whole history of kingship, a run of good rulers unbroken. Under them the empire reached its greatest size, its widest bounds, its deepest peace and richest prosperity. One of them, a bold soldier emperor from Spain, the first of many emperors who would come not from Italy at all, but from the provinces. A sign of how thoroughly Rome had folded the conquered world into itself, pushed the frontiers of the empire to their furthest limit, north across the great river into the cold forests of the Dacians, east into the deserts and rich cities of the Parthians, so that for a brief moment the Roman world stretched from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf, from the misty wall in the north of Britain to the sands of Arabia, and the Middle Sea, that great sea around which the whole story had turned, was a Roman lake ringed on every shore by Roman provinces, so that the Romans called it, simply, our sea. His successor, a restless and cultured traveller, judged the empire had grown too large to hold, and gave up some of the furthest conquests, and spent his long reign journeying tirelessly from province to province, seeing his enormous realm with his own eyes, building and inspecting and ordering, and it was he who, on the wild northern edge of Britain, built that great wall of stone running from sea to sea across the neck of the island, to mark the limit of the Roman world and hold back the unconquered tribes beyond. A wall whose ruins still run across those green northern hills, the empire's furthest visible edge, a line drawn in stone at the very rim of the known world. And the last of these good emperors is perhaps the most beloved of all the Romans who ever lived, a grave and gentle and deeply thoughtful man, a philosopher on the throne, who never wanted power and took it only from duty, and who spent much of his reign not in splendour but in hardship, on the cold northern frontier, in the mud of the camps, fighting off the pressure of the barbarian peoples who were now beginning, more and more, to push against the long borders of the empire. And in the evenings, in his tent, by lamplight, this most powerful man in the world wrote down, only for himself, never meaning them to be read, a set of quiet, private meditations on how to live, on how to bear the burden of each day with patience and kindness and courage, on the shortness of life and the folly of anger and the duty we owe one another. And those private notes, jotted by a tired emperor at the edge of the world, survived, by some miracle, across 2,000 years, and are read still, and loved still, by people who have never cared a moment for Rome or its wars, simply because they are wise and true and kind, and it is a strange and lovely thing. When you think of it, that of all the mighty works of Rome, the temples and the roads and the legions and the laws, one of the things that has travelled furthest and touched the most hearts is a lonely man's whispered reminders to himself, in the dark, to be good. Let us pause here, at the very summit of the whole long climb, and look about us for a moment at what Rome had built before we begin the long descent, for it is worth seeing the thing whole and at its height, all lit up in its golden afternoon. Imagine then the empire at its peak, perhaps 60 or 70 million people, a quarter or more of all the human beings then alive, living under a single government, from the rain-swept moors of northern Britain to the hot sands of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the banks of the great eastern rivers. All of them, whatever their language and their gods and the colour of their skin, able to call themselves, in some degree, Roman, bound it all together. First of all were the roads, the famous roads, tens of thousands of miles of them, built of layered stone with a hard paved surface and proper drainage, running arrow straight across mountain and marsh and desert, so well made that some of them carry traffic to this day. Roads along which the legions could march and the couriers could ride, and the goods of the whole world could travel in safety, so that spices from the Far East and tin from Britain, and grain from Egypt, and wine from Gaul, and marble from Greece, all flowed along them to wherever they were wanted. And where the roads met, cities grew, and every city from Britain to Syria was built to the same comfortable Roman pattern, with its forum for business and politics, its temples to the gods, its law courts, its theatres and amphitheatres for the games, its public baths where men and women of every rank could soak and steam and gossip and exercise for a tiny coin, and above all its water, for the Romans loved clean running water as almost no people before them, and they built to bring it, those soaring lines of arches marching across the valleys, the aqueducts. Carrying fresh water sometimes 50 or 60 miles from the mountain springs down into the hearts of the cities, to feed the fountains and the baths and the public taps, a feat of engineering that would not be matched for well over 1,000 years after Rome was gone. And over all of it lay the two great gifts that Rome, more than anything else, gave to the world: the peace, that long unbroken safety in which ordinary life could flourish, and the law, the great structured body of Roman law, worked out and written down and refined across the centuries by generations of careful jurists. The idea that disputes should be settled not by force or by the whim of a ruler, but by known and public rules applied by trained judges. The idea of contracts and property and evidence and the rights of persons. A way of ordering human affairs so sound and so sensible that it became the foundation of the law of half the nations of the earth, and lives on, in courtrooms all over the world, to this very day, so that a lawyer now, arguing a case in a language the Romans never heard, in a country they never dreamed of, is still, without knowing it, speaking their thoughts and using their tools. That was Rome at its height, and it must have seemed, to the people living in that long golden peace, as though it would simply last forever, as though the eagles would fly and the roads would run and the law would hold until the end of the world. But nothing lasts forever, not even Rome, and the long afternoon was drawing on toward evening, and the first cold winds of the coming night were already, though few yet felt them, beginning to stir along the distant frontiers. The trouble began, as it so often does, at the top, when the last of the good emperors, that gentle philosopher, broke the wise pattern of his predecessors and left the throne, not to the best man he could find, but to his own son, a vain and cruel and idle young man, who cared for nothing but the games and the arena and his own pleasures, and who undid in a few years much of the good that had been so patiently built, and who was in the end strangled by his own wrestling partner in his bath. And with his death the golden age was truly over, and the empire slid, over the following century, into a long and terrible sickness, from which it never fully recovered, though it lingered on for centuries yet. For the deep flaw that Augustus had papered over so cleverly, the lack of any clear and settled way to choose the master of the world, now tore itself open at last, and would not close, and the results were catastrophic. The armies had long since learned that they could make emperors, and now, with no strong hand to restrain them, they made them and unmade them almost at whim, each frontier army raising up its own general and marching him toward Rome to seize the purple, so that the throne became a thing seized by violence and held by fear and lost, more often than not, to a knife in the dark or a battle against the next claimant. Across a span of about 50 years, in the middle of that dreadful century, there were some 20 or more emperors, and hardly a single one of them died peacefully in his bed. They were murdered by their own soldiers, killed in battle against rivals, struck down by assassins, one after another, reigning on average only a year or two before the wheel turned and threw them down, so that the very centre of the Roman world, the office that had held everything together, became a revolving horror of usurpation and murder. And while Rome tore at its own throat in these endless civil wars, the enemies it had held off so long for so many centuries saw their chance and came pouring across the neglected frontiers from every side at once. From beyond the great northern rivers came the Germanic peoples, whole confederations of them now, larger and fiercer and better organized than the scattered tribes of old, breaking across the borders to raid and burn deep into provinces that had known nothing but peace for 200 years, so that cities which had never needed walls, which had spread out comfortable and open in the long security of the Roman peace, now scrambled in terror to throw up hasty ramparts, often tearing down their own beautiful temples and monuments for the stone. And in the east there had risen a new and formidable Persian Empire, a great organized state under warlike kings, and it fell upon the eastern provinces and did the Romans a humiliation without precedent in all their history, defeating a Roman army in the field and taking the Roman emperor himself alive, a living captive, and holding him in shameful bondage until his death. A thing that had never happened before, and that struck at the very heart of Roman pride. And as if the wars were not enough, there came also, as there so often came in the crowded ancient world, the plague, a great pestilence that swept along the very roads and sea lanes that had brought such prosperity, carried from city to city, killing, in some places, a great part of the population, emptying the towns and the fields, thinning the armies, and deepening the general sense that the world itself was growing old and sick, and coming, perhaps, to its end. Trade broke down as the roads grew unsafe, and the seas filled with pirates once more. The coinage, debased again and again by desperate emperors who needed to pay their soldiers and had no honest money to do it with, lost its value, until the silver coins were little more than washed copper and prices ran wild, and men fell back, in many places, on barter, on the direct exchange of goods, as though the whole vast sophisticated economy of the empire were slowly forgetting how to work. And the great cities shrank and pulled in behind their new walls, and the open, confident world of the Golden Age gave way to a harder, poorer, more frightened age of high ramparts and armed men and shrinking horizons. It seemed, for a time, in the depths of that century, as though the whole thing must simply fly apart, as though the empire that had stood for so long was finally coming to its end, breaking into pieces, with whole regions in the west and the east splitting off under emperors of their own, no longer even pretending to obey the centre. And yet, and this is the astonishing thing, the thing that tells you what a mighty and deep-rooted structure Rome truly was, it did not fall. Against every probability, out of the very depths of the chaos, there came a run of tough, grim, competent soldier emperors, hard men risen from the ranks in the wild frontier provinces. Men with no education and no polish and no illusions, but with iron in them, and one by one they fought off the invaders, threw the Germans back across the rivers, held the Persians in the east, hunted down the rival emperors, and reunited the splintering empire by main force, and dragged the whole reeling structure back from the very edge of the abyss. It was a near thing, as near as the darkest days of Hannibal, and it was done not by genius or by fortune, but by sheer stubborn soldierly grit, the same quality that had built the empire in the first place, and at the end of that terrible century the Roman world still stood, battered and transformed, and much the worse for wear, but whole. And it fell at last to one of these hard soldier emperors, the greatest of them, to sit down amid the wreckage and ask himself how the thing might be rebuilt so that it would never come so close to death again. That man was another rough soldier of humble birth from the wild lands across the sea to the east of Italy, a man of great practical intelligence and iron will, who seized the throne and then held it, remarkably, for more than 20 years, and did not die by violence, but laid the power down himself and retired to grow vegetables in the garden of a great palace by the sea, which after the parade of murdered emperors was a kind of miracle all by itself. He looked at the wreck of the 3rd century, and he understood, with a clear and unsentimental eye, that the old system had failed, that the polite fiction of Augustus, the pretense of a republic, the modest first citizen, was long dead and useless, and that the empire was simply too vast and too beset on every side for one man to rule and one man to defend. And so he remade it, root and branch, into something new. Something harder and heavier and far more like an Eastern kingdom than the old Roman state had ever been. He dropped the pretense entirely and made the emperor an open and absolute monarch, a remote and sacred figure robed in silk and jewels, wearing a crown at last, hedged about with elaborate ceremony, before whom men must prostrate themselves on the ground, no longer the first among equals, but a lord set high above all, almost a god on earth. And, understanding that no one man could hold the whole, he divided the rule, choosing a trusted colleague to govern one half of the empire while he governed the other, and then giving each of them a junior partner and appointed successor, so that 4 rulers together, 2 senior and 2 junior, shared the burden and guarded the 4 quarters. A system meant to end the endless wars of succession by settling in advance and in the open who should rule and who should follow. He reorganized the whole administration, doubling the number of provinces and multiplying the officials, building a vast and heavy machinery of government to hold the thing together, and he reformed the army and the coinage and the taxes, and tried, less successfully, to freeze prices and wages by decree and hold back the tide of economic ruin by simple command, which never works, but which showed how desperate and how sweeping the crisis had been. It was a colossal effort of will, and it saved the empire, and bought it in the end another 200 years of life, but it changed the very nature of the thing that was saved, for the empire that came out of his hands was a grimmer, more rigid, more oppressive place than the free and open world of the Golden Age. A place of high taxes and hereditary trades, and men bound by law to the land and the work of their fathers. A great heavy fortress of a state, girded for survival, that had traded much of its old liberty for the simple hope of enduring. And this same iron ruler, in the last years of his long reign, turned upon that strange and stubborn new faith that had been quietly spreading through the empire for 3 centuries now, the faith of the Christians, and launched against it the last and greatest of all the persecutions, a determined effort to stamp it out altogether, tearing down the churches, burning the sacred books, and putting to death those who would not deny their God and sacrifice to the old gods of Rome and to the emperor himself. But it was too late, for the faith had grown too deep and too wide to be pulled up now, and its followers met the persecution with a courage and a joy in the face of death that astonished and unsettled their persecutors, and won, in the end, more hearts than the killing ever cost, so that the very blood of the martyrs became, as one of them said, the seed of the church. And within a single generation of that last great persecution, the whole thing turned completely over, in one of the most extraordinary reversals in all of history. For the 4-ruler system that the old reformer had built fell apart in civil war the moment his strong hand was gone, as such carefully balanced systems so often do, and out of the wars there rose a new master of the Roman world, a bold and able and ambitious general, the son of one of the 4 rulers, who fought his way to sole power in a series of campaigns, and who, on the eve of the battle that would make him master of Rome itself, is said to have seen a sign in the sky, a cross of light, and to have heard a promise that in that sign he would conquer, and who ordered the symbol of the Christians painted upon the shields of his soldiers, and who won, and who thereafter, whether from true conversion or cold calculation, or most likely some deep mingling of the two, threw the whole weight of the imperial power behind the faith that his predecessor had tried so hard to destroy. He ended the persecutions and granted the Christians freedom to worship and returned their confiscated property and showered wealth and privilege upon their church and built great basilicas for their worship in Rome and across the empire, and involved himself deeply in their affairs, calling their bishops together from all over the world to a great council to settle the fierce disputes that were tearing at the young faith, to hammer out under his eye what exactly Christians were to believe, so that the Emperor of Rome now presided over the councils of the Church. And in doing all this he set the whole future of the Western world upon a new road, for from that moment the faith that had begun as a persecuted sect of the poor and the enslaved, fed to the lions in the arena, began its long rise to become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and, through Rome, the religion of Europe and of half the world, so that the cross that had been a Roman instrument of execution became the sign under which Rome itself now marched, an overturning so complete that no one living through the persecutions could ever have imagined it. And this same emperor did one other thing, quieter but almost as momentous, for he understood, as his reforming predecessor had understood, that the true weight and wealth of the empire had shifted eastward, that the rich and populous and civilist heart of the Roman world now lay in the east in the old Greek lands, and that Rome itself, the ancient city on the 7 hills far away in Italy, was no longer the natural centre of things. And so he founded a new capital, a new Rome, in the east, on the site of an old Greek town that guarded the narrow strait between the two continents, the very hinge between Europe and Asia, one of the finest defensive positions on earth, ringed by water on 3 sides, and he lavished upon it all the wealth and art of the empire, and named it after himself the city of Constantine, Constantinople, and it would become, in the centuries to come, the greatest and richest and most beautiful city in the whole Christian world, and it would outlast the old Rome and the old empire in the west by 1,000 years. After that great emperor died, the empire drifted, over the following decades, toward a division that would in the end become permanent, for it had simply grown too large and too pressed on every frontier to be ruled as one, and time and again it was split between rulers, a man in the west governing from Italy or from cities nearer the northern frontier, and a man in the east governing from the splendid new capital by the strait, until at last, near the end of that century, a strong emperor died and left the whole to his 2 young sons, one taking the east and one the west, and this time the division was never healed, and the 2 halves went their separate ways, and were never truly joined again. And it matters, this division, more than almost anything else in the whole later story, for the 2 halves were not equal, and did not share the same fate. The eastern half, the Greek-speaking half, was the older, richer, more populous, more civilized, more defensible part, with its great fortress capital and its deep reserves of wealth and people, and it would survive, battered but unbroken, for another 1,000 years. The western half, the Latin-speaking half, the old heartland, the part that held Rome itself, was poorer, emptier, more exposed, with longer and more vulnerable frontiers and fewer resources to defend them, and it was the western half that would go under within a single lifetime of that final division, and take with it, when it fell, the old classical world of the West. And the thing that pushed it under, in the end, was a great movement of peoples, one of those vast, slow migrations that from time to time reshape the whole map of the world, and it began far away, out on the great grasslands of the East, where there arose a fierce and terrible people of mounted nomads, superb horse archers, swift and merciless, who came riding out of the East and fell upon the Germanic peoples living beyond the Roman frontier, and drove them, in terror, westward before them. And so the Germanic nations, fleeing this new horror at their backs, came crowding up against the long Roman frontier, not now as raiders looking for plunder, but as whole peoples, men and women and children and cattle and carts, entire nations on the move, desperate to get across the river and into the shelter of the empire, away from the riders behind them. And one great people among them, a Gothic nation, begged the Eastern Emperor to let them cross the river in peace and settle inside the empire as farmers and soldiers, and the emperor, thinking to gain subjects and troops, agreed, and let them cross, hundreds of thousands of them. But then his officials, corrupt and greedy and contemptuous, cheated and starved and abused these desperate refugees so cruelly, selling them dog meat at ruinous prices, seizing their children, that the Goths at last rose in fury and took up arms, and the emperor marched against them with a great army to crush them, and instead, on a dreadful day near a city in the eastern Balkans, the Gothic horsemen fell upon the Roman legions and destroyed them utterly, killing the emperor himself, who vanished in the rout and was never found, perhaps burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken refuge. One of the worst defeats in all the long history of Roman arms, a defeat that rang through the whole empire like a cracked bell. For it showed, as nothing had shown for centuries, that the legions could be beaten badly on Roman soil by the barbarians, and that the frontier was not the solid wall it had always seemed, but a thing that could be broken. And after that great defeat the empire never quite got the Goths out again. They were inside now, a whole armed nation wandering within the borders, sometimes bought off, sometimes hired as soldiers, sometimes fought, sometimes settled, but never again simply expelled, a permanent presence, a nation within the state that did not melt away into Romans as the conquered peoples of the old days had done, but kept its own leaders and its own arms and its own restless hunger for land. And this was the new and fatal thing, the thing the old empire in its strength had never had to face, not raids that could be driven back, but whole peoples come to stay, come to live inside the Roman world and take a share of it. And the weakened Western Empire, its armies now themselves largely made up of Germanic warriors, its defence increasingly in the hands of the very peoples it was meant to be defending against, no longer had the strength to say no. Through the last decades of that century and into the next, the pressure grew and grew, more peoples crossing more frontiers, the Rhine itself freezing hard one bitter winter, so that a whole flood of nations walked across the ice into Gaul and poured through it and down into Spain, never to be dislodged, the western provinces filling up region by region, with Germanic kingdoms setting themselves up on Roman soil, at first in the name of the emperor, as his supposed allies and soldiers, and then, more and more, simply as themselves, as kings in their own right, ruling the old Roman lands and the old Roman people, while the emperor in Italy, penned in a marsh-guarded refuge, grew ever weaker and more helpless, a phantom of authority presiding over an empire that was dissolving beneath him like sand running out between the fingers. And then came the blow that stunned the whole world, east and west, Christian and pagan alike, a thing that had not happened in 800 years, not since the far-off day when the wild Gauls had burned the young city and only the geese on the capital had saved it. For the great Gothic nation that had settled within the empire, led now by a bold and restless king, wandered down at last into Italy itself, seeking land and payment and a permanent home. And when the feeble government penned in its marshes played them false once too often, the Goths marched on Rome, the ancient city itself, the eternal city, the mother of the whole empire, and laid siege to it. And after a time the gates were opened, whether by hunger or by treachery no one is sure. And the Goths came in, and for 3 days they sacked the city of Rome. They were Christians, these Goths of a sort, and they spared the great churches and the people who sheltered in them, and it was not the utter massacre that such a sack might have been in older and harder days, but they plundered the city thoroughly, carried off its treasures and its wealth, and the mere fact of it, the fact that Rome, which had taken the whole world captive, which had not seen an enemy inside its walls for 8 centuries, which had come to seem as eternal and unshakable as the hills it stood on, had been taken and looted by barbarians, sent a shock of horror and disbelief around the entire world. Men far away in distant provinces wept when they heard it, and could not believe it, and said that if Rome could fall then nothing was safe, and the end of the world itself must surely be at hand. And a great Christian teacher, hearing the news in his city far across the sea in Africa, sat down and began to write a vast book to answer the anguished question everyone was asking, which was how such a thing could be permitted to happen, and to argue that the true and eternal city was not Rome at all, not any city made by human hands, however great, for all such cities must one day fall, but only the city of God, which alone endures. The old city on the 7 hills survived even this, of course, battered and diminished. Cities are hard to kill outright, and Rome would be sacked again, more cruelly, by another Germanic people from across the sea in Africa a few decades later, stripped this time even of the gilded roof tiles of its temples. And still it survived, shrunken, poorer, emptier, a great half-ruined shell of its former self, where a small population huddled among the vast marble monuments of a greatness they could barely remember and could no longer imagine building. But the empire in the West as a working thing, a state, a government that ruled and defended and held together, was now visibly dying, province by province, year by year. And there came, in those last decades, one final great terror out of the East, when the fierce nomad horsemen whose first coming had set the whole migration in motion long before were united at last under a single dreaded war leader, a king whose name became a synonym for the scourge of God, and who led his vast host of riders and subject peoples on a career of devastation across the whole of Europe, from the eastern plains into Gaul and down into Italy, burning and slaughtering, until it seemed that this new horror might sweep away what little of the Roman world remained. He was checked at last in a great and bloody battle in Gaul, where, in one of history's strange final ironies, a Roman general and his Gothic allies, the old enemy and the newer one fighting side by side, together turned back the common terror from the east, and then, when the war king turned instead upon Italy and marched toward Rome, he was met, so the story goes, not by an army, for there was hardly an army left, but by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who rode out unarmed to meet him and spoke with him. And, whether from the churchman's words, or from plague in his own camp, or from the simple pull of his overladen wagons of plunder homeward, the dreaded king turned back and spared the city and withdrew and died not long after, and his great empire of horsemen fell to pieces as quickly as it had risen, and the terror passed. But the West did not recover. The emperors of those last years were shadows, boys and puppets raised up and cast down by the Germanic generals who now truly held the power, the commanders of the barbarian soldiers who were the only real army left, and the whole sad farce grew thinner and emptier until it simply stopped. Quietly, almost without anyone noticing, in a year we count as 476 after the birth of Christ. For in that year the last of these puppet emperors in the West, a boy who bore, by a strange chance of history, the names of both the founder of the city and its first great emperor, the name of Romulus who had raised the first wall, and the name of Augustus who had built the peace, this last little emperor, a child, was quietly set aside by the Germanic general who commanded the soldiers of Italy, a man who saw no further need for the pretense of a Western emperor at all, and who did not bother to name another, but simply sent the imperial robes and crown away to the emperor in the east, and asked, in effect, to rule Italy as that distant emperor's officer, a Germanic king in all but name. And so, without a battle, without a massacre, without even very much notice at the time, the line of emperors in the West, which stretched all the way back 500 years to the cold, clever young man who had become Augustus, and behind him 1,000 years and more to the boy watching his sheep on the hill above the river, came quietly to its end, and the Western Roman Empire, which had ruled so much of the world for so long, was simply, finally, gone. And yet, and this is the thing that so many people forget when they speak of the fall of Rome, half of the empire did not fall at all. The eastern half, the richer and stronger half, ruled from the great fortress city by the strait, went on, unbroken, calling itself the Roman Empire, for its people never stopped thinking of themselves as Romans, never for a single day, even though they spoke Greek and worshipped in the Christian way, and lived a life that would have seemed strange indeed to the old Romans of the Forum. They were Romans still, in their own minds and in their own unbroken laws, and in the unbroken line of their emperors, and their empire, which later ages would give the separate name of the Byzantine Empire, but which they themselves simply called the Empire of the Romans, would endure for very nearly another 1,000 years after the West had fallen. 1,000 years, a span of time as long as from that fall to a point well past the discovery of the far continents across the ocean. And for a brief and shining moment, not long after the West went under, it seemed as though the whole thing might even be put back together, for there arose in the East a great and ambitious emperor, a man of enormous energy and vision, who dreamed of reconquering the lost western provinces and restoring the empire whole, and who very nearly did it. He sent his brilliant generals west, and they took back Africa from the Germanic kingdom that held it in a single swift campaign, and then crossed into Italy and, in a long and terrible war that dragged on for a generation and wrecked the peninsula far more thoroughly than any barbarian sack had done, at last wrested Italy itself, and Rome, the old mother city, back into the empire, and took a foothold in Spain as well, so that once again, for a few decades, the Middle Sea was very nearly a Roman lake, ringed with Roman provinces, ruled from the great eastern capital. And this same emperor did a thing that outlasted all his conquests, and was worth far more than any of them, for he gathered the whole vast tangled inheritance of Roman law, the accumulated statutes and rulings and legal wisdom of 1,000 years, grown by now into a chaos too huge for any man to master, and he set his finest jurists to sorting it all out, cutting away the dead and the contradictory, and arranging the whole living body of it into a single ordered code, clear and complete, and that great codification of the Roman law. Made in the East a lifetime after the Western Empire fell, became the vessel in which the wisdom of Roman law was carried down through all the centuries that followed, the fountain from which the legal systems of most of Europe, and through Europe of much of the world, would one day drink, so that this one emperor's careful sorting of old law books did more to shape the future of mankind than all the battles he ever won. But the dream of a restored and reunited empire did not last. The reconquest had cost more than the empire could truly bear, exhausting its treasury and its armies, and wrecking the very lands it had recovered, and no sooner was that great emperor dead than a new wave of enemies fell upon the overstretched empire from every side, new peoples pushing into the Balkans, the old Persian foe renewing the endless Eastern War, and Italy itself so dearly bought, largely lost again within a few years, to yet another Germanic people come down over the Alps. And then, within a century of that last great effort, there burst out of the deserts of the far south and east a wholly new power that no one had seen coming, the sudden explosive expansion of the Arab peoples, newly united and fired by a new faith, who in an astonishingly short time overran and tore away from the Eastern Empire more than half of all it had, all the rich lands of the Near East and Egypt, and the whole southern shore of the Middle Sea, the very provinces that had been Roman since the days of the great conquests, gone in a single generation, never to return. And so the Eastern Empire was cut down, over those hard centuries, from the master of the whole Eastern world to a smaller, tougher, more embattled Greek Christian state, clustered around its mighty capital, fighting grimly and skillfully for its survival against enemies on every side, and yet it survived, again and again, when by every reasonable measure it should have gone under. For its great city was the strongest in the world, ringed by its enormous triple walls that turned back besieger after besieger for 1,000 years. And behind those walls the old Roman state lived on, with its emperors and its law and its ceremonies and its unbroken sense of itself, the last living fragment of the ancient world, keeping the lamp of classical civilization, the old books and the old learning and the old law, burning through the long dark centuries when so much of it had been lost and forgotten in the ruined West. It would endure, this last Rome, through triumph and disaster, through golden ages and near-death agonies, for 1,000 years, until at last, far in the future, in a year we count as 1453, long after the West had built and forgotten whole new worlds of its own, the great city by the strait would fall at last, after a desperate siege to a new and mighty empire from the east, and the last emperor of the Romans, a man who still bore, across 2,000 years, the very title that the cold young Augustus had first so carefully disguised, would die sword in hand in the breach of his broken walls, and only then, only in that far-off year, would the Roman Empire, which had begun with a boy and a she-wolf by a muddy river, truly and finally come to its end, more than 2,200 years after the founding of the city. But let us come back now, gently, from that far future to the fallen West, to the old heartland of the empire, in the years and the centuries after the last little emperor was quietly set aside, and let us ask the question that people have been asking and arguing over ever since, which is why. Why did it fall, this vast and mighty and seemingly eternal thing that had stood for so many hundreds of years and ruled so much of the world? And the honest answer, the answer that all the long study of it comes to in the end, is that there is no single answer, no one cause, but a great slow gathering of many causes, working together across centuries. The way a great old tree does not fall for any one reason, but from the long working of rot and weather and weight and time altogether, until one ordinary day a wind that it would once have shrugged off is enough to bring it down. There was the deep flaw at the heart of the system, the lack of any settled way to pass on power, which fed the endless ruinous civil wars that again and again turned the empire's strength against itself. There was the sheer crushing cost of defending those enormous frontiers, thousands upon thousands of miles of them, against enemies who grew steadily stronger and more numerous, a cost that ground the people down under ever heavier taxes until the burden of being defended came to feel as heavy as being conquered. There was the slow economic exhaustion, the debased coinage and the broken trade, and the shrinking of the great cities, and the way the empire had come to rest so heavily on the labour of slaves, and then on peasants bound like slaves to the land, a foundation that could not bear the weight forever. There was the way the army itself, over the centuries, filled up more and more with the very Germanic peoples it was meant to hold back, until the defence of the Roman world lay largely in the hands of men who were not, in their hearts, Romans at all, and who in the end simply became the new masters. And there was above all, perhaps, the great migration of the peoples, that vast slow tide of nations pushed westward out of the east, wave upon wave of them, more than the weakened Western Empire could absorb in the old way, more than it could turn into Romans, so that, instead of being folded in, they broke it apart and settled down on its pieces. All of these and more working together across long centuries, so that the fall, when we look at it closely, is not really an event at all, not a single crash on a single day, but a long, slow, gradual thing, a fading and a dwindling and a transformation so gradual that the people living through it very often did not know that they were living through the fall of Rome at all, but only through hard times and worse harvests and more dangerous roads, and a tax collector who no longer came from the emperor but from some Germanic king, and a world that was slowly, in 1,000 small ways, growing poorer and darker and smaller and more local, drawing in from the wide, bright, confident world of the Golden Age toward the narrow and fearful horizons of what later ages would call the Dark. For that is what came after, in the West, not an instant collapse, but a long twilight, in which the great machinery of the Roman world slowly wound down and stopped. The roads, unrepaired, crumbled, the aqueducts, cut or neglected, ran dry, and the great baths fell silent, and the fountains stopped, and the cities shrank back toward villages, and the grand public buildings became quarries, their marble burned for lime, or hauled away to build churches and huts. The long-distance trade withered, and the fine goods stopped coming, and people went back to making what little they needed close to home, and the coins grew scarce, and many places forgot the use of money altogether. The knowledge of how to do great things, how to build a dome, how to make good concrete, how to cut a road across a mountain, was not all lost, but much of it was slipping away as the men who held it died, and the schools that taught it closed, and the peace that had made such works possible was gone. Literacy shrank back until it survived, in the West, mainly in the church, in the monasteries, where a thin line of monks went on patiently copying the old books by hand, saving, almost by accident, fragments of the ancient learning, scraps of Rome, to be treasured up and handed down and, many long centuries later, rediscovered with wonder by an age that had half forgotten there had ever been such a world. And over the wreck of the old order there settled, slowly, a new one, the world we call medieval, a world of small Germanic kingdoms and warrior lords and bound peasants, and, binding it all loosely together, the one great institution that had survived the fall entire and even grown stronger in it, the Christian Church. With the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, sitting in the old imperial city, inheriting something of its old authority, so that even the memory and the shape of Rome lived on, transformed, in the church that had risen inside it. And this is the strange truth at the very heart of the matter, the thing worth carrying down with you now into sleep, that Rome fell, and yet Rome did not die, not really, not ever, for it had sunk its roots too deep into the world for that. For consider, as you lie there in the quiet dark, how much of Rome is still with us, all around us, woven so deeply into the fabric of the world that we hardly see it any more, the way you cannot see the air you breathe. Begin with the very words in your mouth. The old Latin of Rome, the tongue of those farmer soldiers by the river, did not die when the empire fell. It lived on in the mouths of the conquered peoples of the West, and it changed, slowly, region by region, growing away from itself in different directions, until in Italy it had become Italian, and in Spain, Spanish, and in the old land of the Gauls, French, and in the far western province, Portuguese, and in the eastern land where the old soldiers had settled, Romanian. All of them the children of Latin, all of them, in a real sense, Rome still speaking, so that hundreds of millions of people all over the earth today, on every continent, are speaking, without knowing it, a worn and altered and living form of the language of the ancient city. And even in the tongues that are not children of Latin, like the very English of this telling, which is a Germanic tongue at its root, the language of some of those very peoples who came pouring over the frozen river, even there Rome is everywhere, for such tongues borrowed Latin words by the thousand, through the church and the law and the learning of the ages, until half the longer and graver words we use are Roman words in disguise, so that one can hardly speak for a minute of anything serious without Rome speaking through us. And the letters themselves, the very shapes I would be making on a page, the alphabet in which the western half of the world writes, is the Roman alphabet, the letters they carved on their monuments and scratched on their walls, handed down unbroken across 2,000 years, so that these words reach you, in the end, in Rome's own hand. Think too of the law, that great gift we have already touched upon, the deep Roman idea that a society should be governed by fixed and public laws rather than by the will of the strong, that there should be courts and judges and evidence and defence. The whole careful apparatus of justice, worked out over the Roman centuries and carried down and built upon until it became the foundation of the legal systems of most of the nations of Europe, and carried across the oceans by those nations, of much of the rest of the world besides, so that the very idea of law, of rights, of justice, under known rules, as most of humanity now understands it, bears the deep stamp of Rome. And think of the buildings, and the way we build. The Romans were the great engineers of the ancient world, the masters of the arch, that simple and beautiful curve of wedged stones that can carry enormous weight and leap across great spaces, which they used as no one had before to raise their bridges and their aqueducts and their soaring public halls, and the vault. The arch run onward into a tunnel of stone, and the dome, the arch spun round into a great hollow hemisphere of the sky, of which they built one, in the heart of Rome, a vast dome of concrete, open at its very top to the sky, that stands to this day, entire and perfect after nearly 2,000 years, still the largest of its kind ever made without steel. So beautiful and so sound that people have never stopped studying it and copying it. And that word, concrete, points to another of their quiet miracles, for the Romans discovered a way of making a liquid stone, a mixture that could be poured into any shape and would set as hard as rock and even harden underwater. And with it they built on a scale and with a boldness that would not be seen again until our own age. And the knowledge of it was lost when they fell, and had to be painfully rediscovered more than 1,000 years later. Look at the great public buildings of almost any Western city even now, the courthouses and the parliaments and the banks and the museums, with their rows of columns and their triangular gables and their domes and their arches, and you are looking at Rome, at a deliberate reaching back, across all the centuries, to the forms and the grandeur of the ancient city, as though every age since has wanted to clothe its own most solemn and important buildings in the borrowed dignity of Rome. And think, finally, of the great institution that rose within Rome and outlived it, the Christian Church, which took the very shape of the empire for its own, dividing the world into provinces it still calls dioceses, using the old Roman roads and the old Roman tongue, ruled from the old Roman capital by a bishop who took the old Roman title of chief priest, so that for many centuries after the emperors were gone, the Pope in Rome carried down something of the old imperial idea, a single spiritual authority over the whole of the West, an echo of the vanished unity of the empire keeping alive in a new form. The dream that had always been Rome's deepest dream, the dream of one order, one law, one civilization, binding together the whole of the known world. And the idea of Rome itself, the memory of it, the very name, became one of the most powerful things in all of history, long after the thing itself was gone. For age after age, the peoples of the West looked back on Rome the way a man might look back on a golden childhood, as a lost age of greatness and order and peace, and longed to bring it back, and tried, again and again, to make themselves its heirs. A great Germanic king, centuries after the fall, had himself crowned emperor of the Romans in the old city by the Pope, reviving the very title, and founded an empire that would call itself Roman, in one form or another, for 1,000 years more. The rulers of the far eastern lands, whose faith and letters had come to them from the great city by the strait, took for themselves the old imperial name, so that the very word by which they called their emperors was simply the name of the first great Caesar, worn down by time and distance and a foreign tongue, but still unmistakably his name. And when, long afterward in the age of revolutions, men rose up to throw off their kings and build new nations governed by the people, it was to Rome that they looked, to the old republic, to its senate and its consuls and its stern virtues, and they gave their new assemblies Roman names, and raised Roman columns on their public buildings, and carved Latin mottos over their doors, and modelled their very idea of a free and self-governing people upon the memory, half real and half dreamed, of the Republic of Rome. So that Rome in the end conquered the future far more completely and far more lastingly than it had ever conquered the world with its legions, ruling not through its soldiers, who were long since dust, but through its language and its law and its letters and its arches and its faith, and above all, through its example, through the sheer overwhelming idea of it, the idea that there had once been a single great civilization that had gathered the whole world into one, under one law and one peace, and that such a thing had been possible, and might perhaps be possible again. And now, at the very end of our long night's journey, let us go back, one last time, all the way back to where we began, to that low green hill above the slow brown river, in the soft last light of an evening, thousands of years ago, and to the boy sitting in the doorway of his hut with a stick across his knees, watching the sheep and the water and the darkening sky. Everything we have travelled through tonight, the whole vast 1,000-year climb and the long slow fall, all of it was still to come for him. Unimaginably far off, folded up invisibly in the future like a great tree folded up inside a seed. The kings and the republic, the wars with Carthage and the marching legions, the crossing of the Rubicon and the daggers in the Senate, the cold, clever young man who became the first emperor and the long golden peace, the mad tyrants and the wise philosophers, the great fire and the roaring arena, the barbarians poring over the frozen river and the Goths in the streets of Rome and the last little emperor quietly set aside, and then the 1,000 years of the Eastern city, and the fall of its walls at last, and the long afterlife of the whole idea, running down through all the centuries to reach, tonight, you, lying here in the dark, listening, on the far side of 2,000 years and more, in a land and an age that boy could never have dreamed of, in a world still shaped, in 10,000 quiet ways, by the muddy little village on his hill. He knew none of it. He only knew that the sheep must be brought in, and that the fire was warm, and that the evening was coming on, and that the river went by below as it had always gone by, and would always go by, patient and slow and the colour of weak tea, in the gathering violet dark. And perhaps that is the truest and gentlest lesson of the whole long story, the one to carry down with you now into sleep, that the greatest things begin as the smallest and most ordinary things, a few huts by a river crossing, a boy watching his flock, and that the mightiest empires the world has ever seen rise and shine and fall and pass away, and turn to broken marble and grass-grown ruin, and become at last the quiet ground beneath the feet of the people who come after, while the river goes on, and the evening comes on, and the sheep are brought in, as they always were, and always will be, world without end. History does not really disappear. It only sinks down, slowly, and becomes the deep and patient ground on which we build, and stand, and lie down at night to rest. And before we let it all fade at last, let us go back once more, not to the beginning this time, but to the middle, to the height of it, and let us walk, very slowly and very quietly, through the streets of the great city on an ordinary day in its golden afternoon, just to feel what it was like, this thing that grew from the huts on the hill, when it was the largest and busiest and most crowded city the world had yet made, 1,000,000 souls packed onto the 7 hills and the low ground between them, a city that would not be matched in size anywhere on earth for well over 1,000 years after it fell. Picture it before dawn, in the grey hour, when the wheeled carts, forbidden the streets by day because the crush was too great, come rumbling in over the paving stones with their loads of grain and wine and stone and vegetables for the markets, so that the nights of Rome were loud with the grinding of wheels and the shouting of drivers, and a poor man in his upper room, they complained, could hardly ever sleep for the noise, which is a very old complaint indeed, and rather a comfort somehow across all that distance, to know that they too lay awake in the dark, listening to the city, and longing for quiet, just as we do. And then the light comes up, grey and then gold, over the tiled roofs and the temple pediments, and the green of the gardens on the hills, and the city wakes, and the narrow crooked streets between the tall tenements begin to fill. For most of the million lived not in fine houses, but in those tall blocks of flats, several stories high, jammed close together, the poor in the cramped and dangerous upper floors, and the better off below, all of them without kitchens worth the name, and most without running water, so that life was lived largely out of doors, in the streets and the squares and the great public spaces. In a way we can hardly imagine now. Down in the streets the shops open, their wooden shutters folded back, the baker and the butcher, and the wine cellar and the seller of hot food, for a great part of the city bought its meals ready cooked from the little counters that opened onto the street, a hot sausage, a bowl of beans and grain, a cup of wine cut with warm water, eaten standing up amid the crowd. And what a crowd it was, the most mixed and various crowd in all the world, for into Rome flowed people from every corner of the empire and beyond it, so that in a single street you might hear a dozen tongues and see the faces and the dress of Gaul and Syria and Africa and Greece and Spain and Egypt and the far cold north. Merchants and sailors and soldiers and slaves and scholars and priests of 100 gods, all of them jostling together in the greatest gathering of peoples the world had ever seen. And this was the deep genius of Rome. In the end, this drawing in and mingling of all the world, this making of one city and one citizenship out of the whole of humanity, so that a man born in a mud village on the edge of the desert might rise, through the army or through trade or through simple luck, to wealth and honour and the proud name of Roman citizen, and even, in time, some of them, all the way to the throne itself, follow the crowd down to the Forum, the old low ground between the hills that had once been a marsh and a burial ground, and was now the paved and gleaming heart of the whole empire, ringed with temples and law courts and the halls of government, crowded with people going about the business of the world, lawyers and bankers and politicians and idlers and country folk gaping at the splendour. And everywhere the statues, the endless bronze and marble statues of the gods and the emperors and the great men of the past, gilded and painted, looking down on the throng. Here the courts are in session under the great roofed halls, the advocates declaiming, the crowds pressing in to listen. For a good trial was fine free entertainment. Here the money changers sit at their tables. Here the news and the rumour of the whole world is passed from mouth to mouth. And rising above it all, on the hill at the end, the great temple of the chief god of Rome, and on another hill the growing palace of the emperors, spreading year by year across the heights until the very word for a palace, in all our tongues, would come from the name of that Roman hill. As the day grows hot, follow the people to the baths, the great public baths, for this above all was where the Roman spent his afternoon, rich and poor alike, for the cost of the smallest coin or for nothing at all, in vast and magnificent buildings roofed with soaring vaults and floored and walled with coloured marble, greater and grander than almost anything we build for such a purpose now. Here a man would exercise in the open court, and then pass through a series of great halls, the warm room and the hot room thick with steam, heated by hot air flowing through hollow spaces beneath the floors and within the walls, and be scraped clean of oil and sweat, and plunge at last into the cold pool, and then linger, for the baths were not only for washing, but for the whole business of life. A place to meet friends and talk business and hear the news, and eat and drink and read in the library and stroll in the gardens, the great daily gathering place of the city, loud with talk and laughter and the splash of water and the cries of the food sellers, warm and bright and easy. And there is something in the thought of it, all those people of 2,000 years ago soaking away the heat of the afternoon and gossiping in the steam, that feels very close and very human across all that gulf of time. And then, on the days of the great games, the crowd flows instead to the huge arena, the Colosseum, or to the even vaster racetrack where 250,000 people, they say, could pack the tiers to watch the chariots thunder round the long course, the whole city roaring as one for the teams they followed with a passion fiercer than any we give to sport now, the colours dividing families and starting riots, the great charioteers as rich and famous as any men alive. We need not linger over the cruelties of the arena, the fights and the killings and the beasts, which were real and terrible, and which the Romans, for all their lore and their poetry and their engineering, watched with an untroubled pleasure that is perhaps the hardest thing about them for us to understand. We need only note that here too the whole city gathered, high and low together, the emperor himself in his box, all of them bound into one great body by the shared spectacle, bread and the games, as they said, the two things that kept the vast restless city content. And then the long day ends, and the sun goes down behind the hills and the temples, gilding the marble, and the crowds drift home through the narrowing light, and the shops put up their shutters, and the food counters glow with their little fires, and the lamps are lit in 10,000 windows up the dark flanks of the tenements, and the great city settles, for a few hours, toward its uneasy rest, before the carts come grinding in again in the dark. And over all of it, over the million souls and the 7 hills and the temples and the baths and the teeming streets, the same stars wheel that had wheeled over the boy and his sheep 1,000 years before, and the same river runs by below, patient and slow and unregarding, carrying the city's reflection and the moons on its dark and moving water, down toward the sea. And it is worth, before we sink down at last into the quiet, spending one last gentle while on the inner life of these people, on what they believed and how they saw the world, for a civilization is not only its walls and its wars, but its gods and its dreams, and the Romans had a great many of both. In the beginning, their gods were the small and homely powers of the farm and the household, the spirits of the doorway and the hearth and the storeroom, the guardians of the fields and the boundary stones, honoured with a pinch of grain and a splash of wine and a few old words, gods you did not so much love as keep on good terms with, in a careful, practical farmer's way, giving them their due so that they would give you rain and harvest and healthy children in return, a religion less of passion than of proper bookkeeping with the unseen. And over these homely powers, as Rome grew and met the wider world, there settled the great bright gods of the Greeks, borrowed and given Roman names, the king of the gods with his thunderbolt, the queen of heaven, the god of war who was the special father of the Roman people, the goddess of love, the swift messenger, the maiden of wisdom, the god of the sea, a whole shining family of quarrelling, loving, meddling immortals living on their far mountain and reaching down into the affairs of men, whose stories the Romans took over wholesale and made their own. And around and beneath and beyond all these there were countless others, for Rome was endlessly hospitable to gods as it was to peoples, drawing in the deities of every land it touched. The mother goddess from the east with her wild music, the Egyptian goddess of 1,000 names, the Persian god of the bull and the cave who was so beloved of the soldiers, so that the empire was a great teeming marketplace of faiths, and a man might worship as he pleased, and did, mixing and matching among the gods of the world, so long as he also, as a matter of loyalty and good citizenship, gave the old gods of Rome and the spirit of the emperor their formal due. And it was exactly here, on this one small point, that the new faith of the Christians ran into such trouble. For they alone, among all the peoples of the empire, would not do it, would not give the old gods even a pinch of grain, would not call the emperor a god, insisted that there was one god only and all the others were nothing, and this stubborn refusal, which seemed to the tolerant, easy-going, god-collecting Romans a kind of mad and dangerous disloyalty, an atheism almost, is what set the Christians so apart and drew down upon them, now and then, the persecutions we have spoken of, until the day the whole thing turned over and the one god of the stubborn sect became the one god of the empire, and all the bright old gods of Greece and Rome faded at last into stories, into poetry, into the names of the planets wheeling overhead, where they still, if you know how to look, quietly remain. Think, too, of the shape of an ordinary Roman life lived out under those gods. For all the vast machinery of empire rested, in the end, on millions of small and ordinary lives, not so very different from our own. At the centre of it stood the family, and the household, ruled in old Roman theory by the father with an authority that was, in the earliest days, almost absolute, though softened greatly by custom and affection and the passing of the centuries, and around the family the wider web of kin and clan, and the deep Roman reverence for the ancestors, whose wax portrait masks were kept in the halls of the great houses and carried in procession at funerals, so that the dead marched with the living, and a man felt the eyes of all his forefathers upon him, and measured himself against them, and strove not to shame them. For this was the deep old Roman ideal, the thing they called by a word that meant far more than our word duty, a whole knot of loyalty and devotion and doing what is owed, to the gods, to the country, to the family, to the ancestors, all bound together. The sense that a man was not a free-floating self, but a link in a long chain running back to the founders and forward to the unborn, and that his task was to play his part with gravity and steadiness and honour, to be weighty and serious and dependable, to keep his word and stand his ground and endure what must be endured without complaint. They admired, above all things, the man who was steady, who did his duty without fuss, who was frugal and hard and plain in his living even when he was rich, who could leave his plough to command an army and win a war and then, the victory won, lay down his power and go straight back to the plough again, as their oldest and most beloved legends told. And though the reality, of course, fell as far short of the ideal as it always does, still the ideal was there, and shaped them, and gave them that peculiar iron steadiness, that refusal to panic, that willingness to lose 100 battles and go stubbornly on, which is perhaps the truest key to the whole astonishing story, to how the mud village by the river came to rule the world. They were not, on the whole, a subtle or a dreaming or a very original people, not like the Quicksilver Greeks whose art and thought they so admired and so freely borrowed. They were farmers and soldiers and lawyers and engineers, practical, stubborn, disciplined, patient, hard, with a genius not for beautiful ideas, but for the getting of things done, for organisation, for law, for roads and walls and drains and armies and the long patient administration of a world. And it was exactly these unglamorous virtues, and not any brilliance, that built and held the greatest empire the ancient world would ever see. And there is a lesson in that too, perhaps, to fold away with the rest as your thoughts begin to loosen and drift, that it is not always the cleverest or the most brilliant who endure and prevail, but very often the steadiest, the most patient, the ones who simply refuse to give up, who keep on putting one foot in front of the other long after everyone else has sat down, who lose and lose and lose and will not admit it, and go on, until at last, almost without noticing, they have outlasted the whole world. And now the long road is very nearly walked to its end, and there is almost nothing left for either of us to do, but let it all grow soft and dim and fall away. We have come, you and I, all the way from the first small huts on the 7 hills, from the boy and his sheep in the violet dusk, and the she-wolf by the river and the murdered brother, up through the long slow centuries of the Republic, the walkouts and the written laws, the wars with the mountain tribes and the elephants of the Eastern King, and then the great and terrible struggle with Carthage across the sea, the marching of Hannibal over the snows and the dreadful day at Cannae, and the answering patience that would not admit defeat. We have walked through the conquest of the whole bright world of the Greeks and the slow poisoning of the Free Republic by its own vast wealth, the murdered reformers and the private armies, and the road lined with crosses, and the coming of the great man who crossed the little river and would not turn back, and fell beneath the daggers of his friends. We have seen the cold, clever heir build his gorgeous fiction of a republic that was really a throne, and the long golden peace descend, 200 years of it, the roads and the aqueducts and the baths, the philosopher writing his quiet thoughts by lamplight at the edge of the world. And we have followed the slow turning of the afternoon toward evening, the long sickness of the 3rd century and the hard soldiers who saved it, the great reformer and the emperor of the cross and the new city by the strait, and then the gathering dark, the peoples pouring over the frozen rivers. The Goths in the streets of the eternal city, the last small emperor with his borrowed names quietly set aside, and the long twilight settling over the west, while the eastern city kept the old lamp burning for 1,000 years more, and we have seen how none of it, in the end, was truly lost. How Rome sank down into the very ground of the world, and became the language in our mouths, and the law in our courts, and the letters on our page, and the shape of our grandest buildings, and the deep old dream of one order over all. So that the empire that fell so long ago is, in 100 quiet ways, still standing all around us, still holding us up, still here. It is a very great story, perhaps the greatest of all the stories the old world has to tell us, and you have come all the long way through it tonight. And there is nowhere further to go now, and nothing more that you need to hold on to, or follow, or remember. You may let all of it go now, the names and the dates and the wars and the emperors. Let them slip from you the way the day slipped from your shoulders at the very beginning, and pool softly on the floor beside you, to be there in the morning if you should want them, or not. You do not need any of it now. You have only to lie still and breathe and rest. So let the great city grow quiet in your mind, the million lamps going out one by one up the dark flanks of the hills. the streets emptying, the fires banking low, the last carts still now, the whole enormous story softening and settling and sinking down into the deep patient silence out of which it first arose, so long ago, by the slow brown river in the violet dark. Are you still awake?
If you are, there is no need to be. Not any longer, not now. The story is told, and the long road is walked, and the river is quiet, and the lamp has burned low, and everything that needed to happen has already happened, all of it, long, long ago, and been gathered up and carried safely down to us, and is safe and is finished, and asks nothing more of you tonight. If you have enjoyed this long walk through the old world, then on another night, when again you cannot sleep, I would be glad to tell you another such story, another long and gentle road down into the past and down into rest, and there is one waiting for you now, just there, on the screen, whenever you should wish it, whenever the dark is long. And if these quiet journeys are a comfort to you, and only if they truly are, you might gently subscribe, so that other souls lying awake out there in the same wide dark might find their way here too, and rest as you are resting now. And if you have not already, you might leave your town and your local time down in the comments below. That quiet, lovely thread that ties us all together, the thought of all of us scattered across the turning world, in 100 different hours and 100 different kinds of night, all having lain still together and listened to the same old story of the same 7 hills and the same slow river going down to the same old sea. But do not trouble yourself with any of that now. Tonight there is nothing left to do at all, nothing to reach for, nothing to finish, nowhere to be but here, warm and still and safe in the gentle dark. So let the lamp grow dim, let the screen grow dark, let the last of the day slip away and the last of the story with it. Let the great city fade and the 7 hills grow dark and the river run on quietly into the night. Let your breathing slow and grow soft and deep and even like the tide going out. Let your shoulders grow heavy and sink down. Let your hands grow heavy and still. Let the weight of your whole body settle, slowly, 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 down into the bed beneath you, held and safe. Let your thoughts grow slow and loose and far away, like the last small lights of a city seen from a great distance, going out one by one. And let go now gently of everything, of the day and the story and the waking world, and sink down softly and easily, and without any effort at all, into the deep and quiet dark, into rest, into sleep. Close your eyes, there is nothing more to do. Good night and sweet dreams.